Hello, everyone. Omni Sensei here with What If I Was Reborn as Jon Snow the God Emperor? Game of Thrones. Part 6. If you enjoy this kind of content, please smash the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Don't forget to check out the original story linked in the description. I hope you enjoy listening to it. I learned not to trust my visions of the future completely in the harshest way possible. Aenar I Targaryen, God Emperor of Planetos. Seeing the Night's Watch recruits dragging the severed body and limbs of the Ice River clan leader, Aenar sat back down and spoke in a gentle tone. Now that we've cleared the garbage from the environment, we'll begin negotiations again. We understand the benefits your grace is asking for, but this is not a decision we can take lightly. I'll go back to the camp, and after discussing it with the majority, I'll come back with a definitive answer, Mance replied, getting up from his chair. He wanted to accept the proposal, but looking at the leaders of the tribes around him, he knew that many were still reluctant to agree. He didn't want to force something like that. Forcing someone to submit can always bring variables, and he didn't want to cause any more chaos than was already occurring. However, Mance could see that at least a third of the group was ready to agree to the terms, and that took a lot of the pressure off him. Knowing that he had supporters was comforting. Aenar wasn't surprised. If Mance had accepted straight away, he would have suspected that the free folk were tricking him just to get into the north and spread quickly, making it practically impossible to eliminate all the free folk in the north in a short time. Winter is coming, and with it death, Aenar spoke in a calm tone. I'll be expecting good news, Your Grace. Mance looked deeply at Aenar and nodded. May the gods have mercy on us, he said with a serious tone. Mance, I'll be staying at Castle Black as a guest. I'll be seeing if the Southern King is someone of his word, Val said, surprising Mance, who pondered for a moment and accepted the Wild Princess's proposal. Watch out for him, Mance said with a tone tinged with concern. My wife will kill me if anything happens to you. Val smiled at the mention of Mance's wife, her sister Dalla. Like any woman of the free folk, Dalla was an excellent warrior and even wiser than most men. Take care of my sister and unborn nephew, Val said with a serious tone, while looking at the giant one. Besides, I have a great bodyguard. Mance nodded and turned to leave, along with the other leaders of the free folk tribes, leaving Val with one and Ygritte as bodyguards. I hope I'm not a nuisance, Your Grace, Val said to Aenar, who smiled kindly at her. It's an honor to have the famous Wild Princess in my improvised court, Aenar said with a laugh, making Val laugh along with Ygritte. Aenar's eyes fell on Ygritte for a moment. In another reality, in another life, that woman was his great love, and he could understand why Jon Snow had fallen hopelessly in love with that not-so-beautiful red-haired woman. Even looking at her, he felt that the two of them were really compatible. In the free folk camp, in the main tent, Dalla, Mance's wife, held a silver cipher decorated with First Men runes. Her belly was so big that it was hard to imagine how many babies she was carrying and how she could still move. Dalla, like her sister Val, was blonde and blue-eyed. However, in contrast to Val's mature charm, the Queen of the Wild exuded a more youthful aura. Even so, her eyes revealed that despite her age, she was a wise woman, something that many could confirm. Stroking her enormous belly, Dalla whispered to the baby in her womb, You may not be born a prince, but your father is trying to give you a safe home, a place where you can run and play without fear of dying of cold or hunger. Dalla had not yet chosen a name for her son or daughter. According to the customs of the free folk, children were only given names after they reached a certain age. In the far north, children suffered the most, as many didn't survive the first few years of life. However, although she was a long way from seeing the child reach a certain age to receive a name, Dalla had already imagined countless names, for both girls and boys. Suddenly, a feeling of intense cold gripped the air, alarming Dalla, who had been extremely vigilant since her husband's departure. Without hesitation and enduring the pain of being pregnant, the Queen of the Savages shouted, Prepare for battle. As soon as she spoke, drums echoed throughout the camp. She recognized the chill that sent shivers down her spine. It wasn't the cold of winter, but the coldness of death. It wasn't the first time she had felt it. When her parents died and were resurrected in front of her, she had experienced the same icy sensation. An icy mist began to spread silently over the surroundings. Hundreds of bright blue eyes, like blue stars, appeared through the mist. The sound of horses' hooves echoed, alarming the watchmen who were on standby at the edge of the camp. Then tens of thousands of similar eyes opened in the mist. The savages' expressions showed pure terror at the sight of the tens of thousands of undead. And leading the whites were hundreds of men and women wearing ice armor and wielding ice swords, riding dead horses. White Walkers. An army of whites, led by White Walkers. Dalla held a sword, but didn't leave the tent. She had a more important task than fighting, protecting the Horn of Winter. She knew exactly why the Night King had ordered the attack so close to the wall, where his powers were weakest. He had discovered that the Horn of Winter was in her possession. In the sky, a three-eyed raven was watching the army of whites led by 100 White Walkers, looking stern and full of concern. At that moment, he felt that he was having trouble seeing scenes from the future, as if he was being interfered with by something. Separating another raven from himself, Brinden Rivers, the three-eyed raven, controlled the animal and sent it to deliver a message to Enar on the wall. At the same time, he used the three-eyed raven's body and performed magic again, something he had never thought he would do again. White branches emerged from the hard, frozen ground, wrapping themselves around dozens of whites, strangling them and separating their heads from their bodies. Even with their heads ripped off, the whites continued to move, only their heads remained motionless on the ground. However, faced with tens of thousands of enemies, Brinden, who was old and weak, couldn't slow down the advance much. Especially when the White Walkers noticed him. One of them condensed a spear of ice in his hand and threw it into the air. The spear tore through the wind with an intensity reminiscent of that of a scorpion, showing just how strong a White Walker was. Brinden dodged the ice spear and gave up trying to stop the Whites' army. He focused only on the White Walkers and just prayed that Enar would arrive quickly with Caraxes and incinerate all these enemies right then and there. While Brinden was fighting the White Walkers, uncontrolled brutality was unfolding when the whites collided head-on with the Free Folk army. The horde of whites, who were afraid of nothing, including pain, advanced uncontrollably against the savages. The first encounter between them was brutal, to say the least. The whites gained the upper hand by a large margin, killing thousands in a single onslaught. What caused the most fear were not the whites, but the friends who died and revived instantly, attacking their former comrades in arms without hesitation. While the savage army was fighting the whites, a White Walker sneaked into the camp. On his shoulder, a half-decomposed rat pointed towards the main tent. A cold smile appeared on the White Walker's blue lips, and despite his handsome appearance, only the purest terror was transmitted to the people around. Any men who tried to stop him were easily killed. A second attack wasn't even necessary. They usually died at the first blow, and those who survived were unable to get up and fight again. A boy no older than 11 saw the White Walker and didn't hesitate to attack with his spear. His parents had been killed in front of him by a White Walker. There was only hatred in his eyes. The boy shouted to gain momentum and courage, but faced with the monstrosity that was a White Walker, his struggle seemed futile. The White Walker cut the boy in half, scattering his guts in the surrounding snow. He seemed to still be alive for long seconds, with tears in his eyes, watching the figure who had killed his parents walk away from him. As Enar was preparing to return to his quarters, he raised his head and looked towards the north, his eyebrows heavily furrowed. He felt that the world around him was completely separate from the other dimensions. Endless layers of space superimposed on each other formed a dome that interfered with his prescience. Enar stopped his steps and released the energy of the immaterium dimension inside his body. The brutal energy tore through the fabric of reality itself at atomic levels and ripped a huge hole in the dome that separated him from the immaterium dimension. Normal people couldn't see it, but he could personally see the huge hole in the sky, which, however, was gradually closing. At that moment, Enar knew something was happening. Just as he was about to climb the wall, he caught a glimpse of a black crow crossing the sky towards him. The crow then spread its wings, slowed down and landed gracefully on his shoulder. At the same moment, a message was sent directly to his mind, and Enar's face changed dramatically. Enar spoke to Leda and ran towards Caraxes. "Let's go quickly to Caraxes. The Free Folk are being attacked by an army of whites and White Walkers." Leda's eyes widened, and she quickly followed her king. Miles from the camp, Mance stopped his steps and motioned for everyone to be silent. He began to listen carefully to the small sounds that reached him. When he heard a small war cry, he knew immediately that the camp was under attack. "They're attacking the camp!" Mance shouted and ran towards the camp without any hesitation. There was only anxiety and a touch of fear in his eyes. His wife and unborn child were in the camp. The other leaders weren't far behind either, especially the leader of the giants, Mag, who ran towards the camp with surprising speed for his size. He held a huge wooden club that was the size of a normal man. While Mance was advancing at full speed towards the battlefield with all the leaders of the free folk tribes in the camp, Della was facing the biggest threat she had faced so far in her life. Della could hear the terrified screams outside the tent, and along with the screams of terror, a feeling of cold that was getting closer and closer, showing that the White Walker was getting closer and closer to her and her tent. Then, under Della's calm eyes, the being broke through the layer of fabric at the entrance and entered the tent, making the place even colder than outside. Della shivered at the cold that surrounded her, as if it would swallow her up at any moment. "Oh, beautiful queen, you will die by my cold hands, and I will use your body and that of your unborn child as a slave." The White Walker's voice was like the crackling of ice on a winter lake to Della's ears. Obviously, she hadn't understood what he had said, but she could make out the meaning of his words from the gestures the White Walker made as he spoke. Without any hesitation, she knocked over the pedestals containing the hot coals, causing a fire all around. "Mortal fire may work on whites, but not on us, Queen of the Wild." The White Walker spoke with a sadistic smile outlining his thin, graceful lips. Again, Della didn't understand his words. She had never heard such an ugly and frightening voice before. Still, Della didn't back down and pulled out a sword and, despite being pregnant, advanced while the fear in her heart grew by the moment. But thinking of her son and the winter horn on her belt, she knew she couldn't back down. The White Walker's ice sword moved, cut through the air, and when both swords clashed, Della's body flew backwards, falling heavily to the ground. Unfortunately, she had fallen on her belly, causing the strong woman to let out an extremely painful moan as strands of blood ran down her legs. The strength of a White Walker was not something an ordinary human could fight. They had the strength of 10 men and were as fast as a cheetah. Without the White Walker's weaknesses, it was completely impossible for a human to kill a White Walker. Della, still lying on the ground and with blurred vision, touched the blood dripping between her legs with her trembling hand and knew that she had hurt her son, possibly killing him. A simply agonizing pain made the woman let out a cry of desolation. It wasn't a physical pain, but a mental pain that seemed to come from her very soul. The cry of a mother mourning her son made the White Walker smile even more cruelly. It was music to his ears. As a being born to hate anything that had warmth and life, he loved the feeling of causing pain in a person. As the White Walker approached Della on the ground, he suddenly stopped and looked back. Sounds of heavy footsteps were heard, and the entire burning tent was dragged away by a colossal force, exposing Della and the White Walker for all to see. The flames had already consumed the camp, while war cries and wails blended into a symphony worthy of being played in hell. The White Walker was unable to react when the great wooden club struck him full on, throwing his body backwards as he spun in the air. He fell to the ground like a horse turd, but soon got up, showing that he was intact. At least he was, but the ice armor couldn't say the same. On it, countless cracks were spreading, revealing the force of the blow. The White Walker ran towards Mag, the leader of the giants, at a speed almost imperceptible to ordinary eyes. In seconds, he covered the distance of 30 meters and arrived in front of the giant in an instant. Mag simply swung his club again. A furious roar erupted from the gigantic being, but this time the White Walker managed to dodge, performing an acrobatic feat in the air impossible for any human. With a swift blow from the icy being's ice sword, he opened a large gash in the Mag giant's hairy skin. Blood spurted into the air, but Mag ignored the pain in his arm and attacked the White Walker with a sequence of brutal, fast attacks. The White Walker dodged each attack inches away from being hit, showing that even he wasn't as relaxed as he looked. Della, still lying on the ground with her hand on her stomach, got up with a look full of hatred, but thinking of what she had to protect, she took a few staggering steps away. However, the White Walker noticed her leaving and condensed a spear of ice in his hand. After dodging another blow from Mag, he threw the spear towards the queen of the savages. Mag tried to stop the attack by throwing herself into the middle of it, but he was slower and the spear passed right through him. On the other side, Mance, who had just arrived at the camp, ran towards his tent, ignoring everything else. His expression lit up when he saw his wife's figure, and although she seemed to be injured, he felt enormous relief to see her still alive. But then, the expression on Mance's face hardened, his eyes widening in shock as he watched the spear of ice pierce his wife's back, running through her body from side to side. What was most cruel was that the spear pierced mercilessly through the center of her belly. "Nu!" He roared furiously as he advanced towards his wife's fallen figure. Arriving in front of her, he crouched down and held her still-living body in his arms. "Mance, our son, our sweet son. I couldn't protect him." Resting her head peacefully on her husband's chest, Della spoke with a trembling tone as tears flowed unstoppably down her cheeks. Her blurred vision began to darken as her gaze remained on her husband's face. In the end, the woman's heartbeat stopped completely and the light in her eyes vanished completely. Mance repeatedly kissed his wife's forehead and whispered as he stopped himself from crying. "It's all right, it's all right, it's all right, it's all right, darling." Mance didn't even mind when Caraxes landed next to him and Enar climbed down from the dragon and ran towards him. Seeing the scene before him, Enar's mood couldn't have been more complicated. However, he soon sensed that the baby wasn't dead. He could see a faint pulse of life coming from Della's belly. "Mance, the child is alive." Enar reached the two of them and spoke in an instant. Even for a moment, Mance woke up to hear Enar's cry. "I can save the child." Enar spoke seriously, looking him straight in the eye. "Do it," Mance pleaded in a trembling voice. Hearing this, Enar didn't hesitate. He removed the spear from Della's belly and opened her belly with a swift movement of the dagger given by Mance. He cut through the placenta and reached out, pulling out a wrinkled baby covered in blood. Enar looked for any wounds on the baby and saw that half of its head was crumpled in a grotesque way. Without wasting any more time, he cut his wrist and performed a blood ritual on the newborn baby. What were the chances of a premature baby surviving something so brutal so soon after birth? Enar didn't know, he couldn't see into the future at the moment, but he was sure that if he didn't try, the baby would die anyway. Feeding the baby his own blood, Enar only stopped when he felt the amount offered was enough. However, just as he was about to continue, he spotted an icy figure approaching, wielding a sword of ice. "Leda!" Enar shouted, and a white figure shot past him, advancing towards the White Walker. Performing a blood ritual on a newborn baby, Enar couldn't move. He needed to help him control the Immaterium's energy, or the child would explode like a bomb. Leda, aware that Enar could not be distracted, positioned herself in front of the immortal aberration her king had once told her about. A White Walker. A creature that until then had only existed in the pages of books appeared before her. And in that instant, Leda had to admit, the tales about the White Walkers were weak. No written description captured the true presence of those beings. The cold around her was 10 times more intense than the text suggested, and the terror the creature exuded was as palpable as a nightmare come true. But Leda didn't flinch. Never in her life had she known fear, and it certainly wouldn't be now, not after receiving the gift of strength from her king. Drawing dawn from its sheath, the blade seemed more sacred than ever. Leda began to move around the White Walker, circling him like a wolf circling cornered prey. Her cold gray eyes looked more deadly than ever. The White Walker stared at the woman in front of him with blue eyes that resembled blue flames, and for the first time his expression turned serious. It wasn't the sword that was warning him of danger, but her. In his 1,000 years of existence, he had never met a human who made him feel so threatened. Not even the giant he had faced before had aroused in him a sense of danger as intense as that woman in white armor. The White Walker advanced. Her body left residual images in the air as her sword cut through the void at breakneck speed. Clang! Leda blocked the blow with dawn, but felt her arms tremble slightly under the overwhelming impact of the enemy force. The energy transmitted by the clash of the blades was overwhelming. Clang! 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 A relatively calm exchange of blows unfolded on the battlefield. Both were testing each other's strength and technique without any hesitation. Each blow was swift and deadly, always aimed at the opponent's head. Any mistake would result in definitive death. Lita repeatedly brandished Dawn against the ice blade. She was surprised by the strength of the enemy's sword. It was definitely not made of ice, but of a material that only looked like ice. No ordinary steel sword could withstand so many blows from Dawn, a blade forged from meteorite steel. At the same time, each impact of the ice sword froze Dawn's surface, annoying Lita in a way she had never imagined. The White Walker was taking the fight very seriously. His opponent's strength and technique were truly sublime, especially the woman's strength, which matched his own. After 5 minutes of exchanging blows, they both retreated. Lita, in particular, decided to go all out, including the use of lightning manipulation. Lightning crackling. Gray rays danced across Dawn's blade, making the sword even more sacred. "I am Lita, the blade of Enar." Lita introduced herself as she advanced with calm, slow steps, the white cloak of the royal guard accompanying her movements. Imukar, slayer of 1,000 men. Surprisingly, the White Walker replied in the common tongue. As soon as they had introduced themselves, they both disappeared from their respective places and found themselves in the middle of the battlefield in an instant. Lita was even more brutal than before. Dawn cut through the air at such an absurd speed that the very atmosphere distorted around the blade, and a sonic boom echoed throughout the camp. Boom! The blades clashed, and shockingly, the White Walker was thrown backwards, his expression filled with disbelief. He couldn't believe that he had lost a duel of strength against a mere human woman. However, Lita didn't wait for Imukar to recover from the shock. She appeared in front of him in the blink of an eye and swung her sword in a vertical blow. Fortunately for the White Walker, he followed his instincts and conjured an ice barrier to block the enemy attack. Even so, the sword cut through the ice shield with shocking ease, but there was a slight delay in the attack, which allowed the White Walker to dodge by a few centimeters. "You dodged that," Lita commented with a dissatisfied tone. She wasn't dissatisfied that her enemy had escaped, but that she hadn't managed to kill him. All because she hadn't yet completed the blood ritual transformation and wasn't at the peak that Enar had predicted for her. Lightning crackling. Perhaps sensing her dissatisfaction, the gray rays seemed to feed on her anger, becoming even more powerful. They now covered her entire sword and a large part of her arm. Lita unexpectedly felt her reflexes were even better than before. Her reaction speed and strength had also increased. It was then that she understood. Only through battle and the flames of war could she become stronger. Only a perfectly forged sword could be a good sword. And she was determined to be the best sword in Enar. "Die," Lita whispered as she advanced towards the White Walker. Imukar only saw a flash of gray lightning cross his vision like a fleeting image, almost imperceptible even to his eyes. Then, under his wide-eyed gaze, Lita's blade sliced through his body from shoulder to abdomen. In an instant, the White Walker crumbled into small stones of ice that fell to the ground. At the sight of her enemy's death, Lita felt an infinite pleasure run through her body. However, controlling her emotions, she let out a warm sigh, charged with a fiery aura. Without wasting any time, she turned back to the king, where she found him holding a cocoon of blood, a sight that reminded her of her own blood ritual. According to Enar's description, his blood had transformed into a cocoon around her, allowing her, like a butterfly, to emerge as something other than a mere human. She now possessed superhuman strength and abilities. Enar looked at the cocoon in his hands and let out a sigh of relief. The most dangerous part had passed and the child had survived. Even so, he felt that the transformation the baby was going through was not something ordinary. Because of his blood, the baby had a unique connection to the immaterium dimension. The God Emperor knew that the child resting in his arms, undergoing a complete metamorphosis, was destined to be one of his future primarchs. Which primarch exactly? That, he didn't know yet. But he would find out as soon as he had finished annihilating the horde of White Walkers and Whites. Passing the blood cocoon to Mance, who held it as if it were the most precious thing in the world, Enar turned his gaze to Lita and nodded, pleased with his lady commander of the royal guard for having managed to kill a White Walker. "Lita," Take care of Mance and his son. I will burn this horde of whites and White Walkers." Enar said as he approached Caraxes. "Yes, my king." Although she wanted to be by Enar's side, protecting him at all times, Leda was someone who followed Enar's orders with an absolute attitude. However, Enar stopped and turning to Leda, he spoke. "By the way, Capture Whites, we need a sample to show to the Lords of the North. I want to see which idiot will refuse to bend the knee at the sight of an undead." Having said that, he climbed onto Caraxes and the dragon took to the sky with a few quick steps. Leda watched the dragon fly into the sky and looked at Mance, who was holding the blood cocoon containing his son. The king beyond the wall was covering his wife's body with one of the cloths from the surrounding tents while caressing her face with such affection that it surprised her. At the same time, she regretted that the child would grow up without a mother. She knew the pain of growing up without a father and imagined that growing up without a mother was just as painful. In the air, Caraxes flew at a low altitude, less than 30 meters off the ground. Below him, the army of whites and White Walkers clashed with the army of savages. War cries mixed with the savages' cries of pain and fear. Honestly, this war was much more brutal than the war between the Red Legion and the Dothraki. Both sides were human and afraid to die. There was always some hesitation in the blows. But that didn't apply to the whites and White Walkers. They were thinking monsters, partially resembling humans, but definitely not human. They fed on the warmth of the living and seized corpses with necromancy. There was no hesitation in their actions, almost as if taking a life was as natural as breathing. The White Walkers, in particular, were literal monsters on the battlefield. Just one of them could take on hundreds of men. Worst of all, they were fast and excellent swordsmen, which made them real killing machines. Enar estimated that his soldiers would have to go through the blood ritual to fight such a monster. Of course, if the enhanced soldiers had heavy armor and firearms, things would be completely different. The soldiers he planned to create would be even more deadly than the White Walkers, truly fearless warriors. Even if they were assigned to a suicide mission, they would accept the order without any hesitation. These were the soldiers Enar wanted to create, mainly to fight against the evil forces of the evil gods and the future chaos gods. Stroking Carax's neck, Enar whispered, "While my fearless soldiers have yet to be born, it'll be you and me supporting the empire of humanity, partner. Let's put on a show for the free folk and bring them hope." Dracaries. In a mere instant, a loud, grandiose roar rang out across the battlefield sky. The gigantic crimson creature flew low and spat out red flames. The flames descended from the sky and hit the ground, literally creating a sea of fire. All the whites that came into contact with the red flames were reduced to ashes without any difficulty. A long, straight curtain of fire, 100 meters long, appeared on the battlefield. The snow mixed with the ashes of the whites, creating something truly incredible to behold. Enar didn't focus on the whites. He just helped the free folk reorganize to defend their position while he prepared to deal with the real problem, the White Walkers. These beings were quite problematic, especially with the current number of hundreds of them on the battlefield. They all knew how to conjure ice magic and necromancy, which was the real problem. "Perseus," Enar whispered and held out his hand. He seemed to be holding an imaginary bow and pulled the bowstring. Surprisingly, a fiery arrow formed between his fingers. The arrow seemed to be made of pure fire. It burned as expected and looked especially frightening. Taking aim at a White Walker, Enar held his breath and released the arrow, which shot out like a bullet, tearing through the air at subsonic speeds and hitting the enemy directly in the chest. The fiery arrow pierced the icy being's armor, and in the next second, the arrow simply exploded. The White Walker became ice rubble in an instant. Enar didn't stop. While Caraxes burned everything in front of him, he conjured fire magic and killed them one by one. Each arrow could be conjured in 2 seconds, and the conjuring time got faster and faster as Enar increased his proficiency. Obviously, the White Walkers didn't stand around waiting to be killed. They ran across the battlefield, dodging the arrows and dragonfire that rained down on them. As they dodged, they counterattacked, throwing ice thorns at the dragon and its rider. But despite his size, Caraxes was young, powerful, and surprisingly agile in the air, capable of performing real acrobatics. The savages watched in awe as the epic scene unfolded before them. They could imagine that Mance would write a song about that moment. How could he not? The scene before them was worthy of a story that would be told for thousands of years. Mance, who had arrived on the battlefield carrying a blonde, blue-eyed baby, looked at it all with a calm gaze. But inside, he really wanted to be in Enar's place, burning the creatures that had taken his wife's life, making them feel the same pain he felt. Looking down at his son in his arms, his gaze softened. Although his son couldn't be a prince, he could be the heir to his future house. With the size of the fief that Enar had granted him, he would become a great lord in the north, second only to House Stark in the future. Turning away, Mance saw Lotta watching the battlefield with an anxious look, as if she wanted to take part in the war. "You can go. I can take care of myself," Mance said, standing up straight. At his waist, a silver horn with runes of the first men could be seen. It was the Horn of Winter, the reason his wife had died. Despite Mance's words, Leda remained by his side. She remembered the king's orders and would carry out her mission until he ordered otherwise. Seeing this, Mance sighed, but said nothing. He focused on what was happening at the moment and took command of the army of savages without any hesitation. Even with a baby in his arms, he drew his sword and went to the front line, which made Leda very happy, as she could now take part in the war while protecting him. Brinden, who controlled the three-eyed raven, watched as the battlefield gradually shifted to the side of humanity and sighed with relief. He really couldn't hold out much longer. He was old and about to die, unable to use much of the weirwood's power. However, when he saw Enar performing fire and blood magic, he realized that the boy had seen things from the past and learned a lot. But he needed to warn the young king not to spend too much time in the past. The Valyrian dragon gods might be dead in the present, but they weren't in the past. If Enar returned to the past too often, he would be felt by those gods, and that was definitely not a good thing. Especially for people like him, who could project their consciousness into the past. It wasn't at all difficult for a god to capture his projection and enslave it. This wasn't scaremongering, it had already happened to other green seers. Gods could be incredibly powerful when they were backed by the infinite power of faith. Suddenly, when Brinden felt he was about to lose control of the three-eyed raven, a new wave of magic filled him. He looked up at Enar atop the dragon and was shocked to see him pointing at him. Secretly admiring the young king's superb control of magic, Brinden bravely advanced against the White Walkers. He felt 18 again, full of strength and youth, the same young man who had fought for the hand of his half-sister Sharera Seastar. Remembering that incredible woman, Brinden couldn't help but speed up his magical attacks even more. And unlike before, he now had magic to abuse. Rise. Shockingly, 30 treemen sprang from the ground and stood an impressive 15 meters tall. They moved slowly, but their blows with the roots were not slow at all. Enar couldn't help but smile with excitement. He felt like he was in Narnia, fighting the White Witch. All that was missing was a talking divine lion. Remembering that the god of many faces was called the Night Lion, Enar smiled mischievously. He wished the god were there. Maybe he could get a lion carpet to decorate his throne. Sensing Enar's excitement, Caraxes was also extremely happy. They both seemed born for war. Only by fighting could they feel the true pleasure of war. The Crimson Dragon unleashed flames even more violently than before, his flames making the snow melt and the earth scorch. The White Walkers and Whites were the ones to suffer. Especially the White Walkers. No matter how fast they could never be faster than a flying dragon, so Caraxes practically became their worst nightmare, reducing them to ashes and killing them almost instantly. Even ice shields couldn't last more than half a second in the face of flames capable of melting rock. With a thud, Caraxes landed on the ground. His long neck snaked through the air, and he opened his mouth, shooting a funnel of flames at a group of whites still alive at the moment. There was fire all over the battlefield. Of the army of tens of thousands of whites, there were now only a few hundred left. Enar didn't know if he had killed all the White Walkers, but he was sure he had eliminated most of them. Which, in all honesty, was a great victory. Depriving the Night King of his necromancers was something very valuable, almost 100 dead White Walkers, a feat he hadn't expected to accomplish before the war against the Night King. Suddenly, Enar looked towards the far north. His eyes shone brightly, The dome that prevented him from communicating with the nexus of time and space and the warp dimension had disappeared, or rather had been broken. Looking up, he saw that the color red had advanced a little against the color blue. He knew that his victory over the forces of evil had increased Lolares' power, giving the red god a slight advantage, even though he was on another continent and in enemy territory. At the same time, Enar's prescience returned to normal. Images of the future began to appear before him, endless possibilities laid out in front of him. Honestly, that dome, placed by some god, made him realize that he wasn't invincible, at least not yet. The only thing limiting his power was his own body. But Enar could wait. His body was transforming and would become powerful without him having to do anything. However, there were a few things he could do to speed up this process of improvement. He didn't like being unable to connect to the nexus of time and space, including the warp. Even if it was only for a few minutes, those minutes could be crucial in the Great Crusade. Especially for him, who needed to act as a beacon for when the spaceships crossed the warp, traveling to other points in the known universe. If he couldn't act as a beacon, how could the navigators move in the warp, a place that had absolutely no sense of direction or even the concepts of high and low? However, Enar felt a cold gaze upon him. The Dragon Prince raised his eyes, and his vision seemed to travel hundreds of kilometers away, until it landed on the peak of a snowy mountain. In that inhospitable place, where no race could flourish, a figure was riding a horse. He had blue skin, black armor covered his body, and his eyes were a deep shade of blue. On his rocky-looking head, a crown of ice glittered like blue crystals. The two exchanged glances, intense and murderous. Enar was the champion of light, and the Night King the champion of darkness. Both were born to be eternal enemies. There was no possibility of friendship between them. Their race had determined that they would be adversaries. However, there was a feeling that they both shared at that moment. A feeling of anticipation for the fight that would take place in the future. Curiously, they were both confident that they would win the war. Enar was confident because he could see the future with his prescience, and the Night King was confident in his own strength. Both were extremely certain of their victory, and never even considered the possibility of losing to the enemy. Enar stopped looking at the Night King and turned his attention to the army of savages, who were clearing the battlefield and gathering up the bodies of their dead comrades. Guiding Caraxes towards the free folk, who were gathering up the corpses, Enar approached and spoke with a determined tone. "Let me help you with that." Mance, who was about to set fire to the dead, was surprised for a moment, but lowered his torch and gestured for Enar to continue. Enar spoke in a gentle tone, "Dracaries." Caraxes didn't hesitate. He opened his mouth and unleashed a jet of red flames onto the corpses. Mance, looking at his wife among the dead, held his son and showed him the scene, wanting the baby to remember his mother for once. What Mance didn't know was that the baby would actually remember his mother. A depressing atmosphere hung over the now destroyed camp. Sounds of weeping and wailing filled the air. Widows, sons, daughters, brothers, mothers and fathers had all lost someone. Even though the death toll had not yet been counted, Enar could see that at least 30,000 people had died in the attack. Most of them were men who had fought. Enar let out a sigh. He wished he had foreseen the attack with his prescience to prevent so many deaths, but fate was cruel and didn't care about mortals. Descending from Caraxes, Enar walked up to Mance and placed his hand on the king beyond the wall's shoulder, a silent gesture of comfort and mourning. He never wanted to feel what Mance was feeling at that moment. Just imagining his wives dying gave him an uncontrollable urge to destroy everything. "What's the baby's name, Mance?" Enar asked, looking at the blonde-haired, blue-eyed child. He could see that the baby had mutated from the warp, developing extra limbs on its back. It wasn't noticeable at the moment, but it would become obvious as the child grew. "I ask that your grace appoint him." Mance looked at his son with a gentle gaze and spoke with a determined tone. Enar didn't hesitate to reply, "Sanguinius." The Primarchs were important. They were the generals who would lead his 20 legions. He currently had 4, including Sanguinius, who was still a baby. Note, Titus, Sigismund, Macoro Vulcan, and Sanguinius. They would be demigods, immortal beings and the warriors most loyal to him, and in some ways, more his children than his own blood children. Not that his sons and daughters would be weak. On the contrary, They would be extremely powerful, but Enar would never share his power with them. It wasn't out of selfishness or reluctance to give up his power. He simply didn't want his sons and daughters to bear the burden of seeing the future. Enar knew well that the prescients changed a person. If they could change something for the better, they would. But with the chaos gods on the prowl, any good intention could easily be twisted. How could Enar allow such a thing to happen? Even if his sons and daughters inherited his gifts, they would never inherit the gift of prescience. He alone would be enough to see the future. He didn't want his sons and daughters to fall to the forces of chaos because they wanted to do something good. Sanguinius. Hearing his son's name, Mance didn't complain about how exotic the name was. He just felt that the name had an important meaning for Enar, and that satisfied him. Even if he died in the future, his son would at least have the king's support. This relieved him, as he felt he could be one of those tens of thousands of dead men. When Enar was looking around, he noticed Leda next to him. The girl was still in clean armor, which wasn't surprising. Whites and White Walkers don't have blood, so it's hard to get sucked into something that doesn't exist in the enemy. I've captured 3 whites, my king. Leda spoke, remembering the task Enar had given her earlier. Good work, worthy of being my lady commander. Enar nodded with satisfaction. With the whites, it would be much easier for the northern lords to bow down. Leda seemed immensely happy with Enar's praise. She wished she had more enemies for her to capture and receive more praise from her king. Let's go. Enar spoke in a calm tone, ignoring Leda's abnormally happy look. Are they going to kneel? Leda followed Enar and asked in a calm tone. They've already knelt, but they don't know it yet. Climbing into Carix's saddle, Enar replied. He looked at the tens of thousands of people in front of him and let out a sigh. Only a real tragedy could change humans' minds and make them want to evolve. Which was strange. You had to be facing a precipice to want to change. Humanity was strange, but perhaps that was why humanity was the reason the Chaos Gods were born. This chaotic and contradictory entropy of humanity was the perfect nourishment for the Immaterium. Under the eyes of all the Night's Watch, Mance Rayder, king beyond the wall, knelt and placed a crown of ivory bones at Enar's feet. I, Mance Rayder, abdicate my titles and become your vassal. My sword and shields are yours. I will defend your laws as if they were my own, and I will fight by your side, as will my sons and their sons after him. Mance spoke with a serious voice full of majesty. He was kneeling before Enar, looking straight into the purple eyes of the boy who had saved his son's life. I, King Enar I Targaryen, first of his name, Knight of Caraxes, King of the Undulls, the Roynars and the First Men, Lord of the 7 Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm, Father of Dragons, Son of the Light of Volantis, the Promised King, Destroyer of the greatest Khalasar of his time. Enar pronounced his long list of titles, looking at the man kneeling before him. His voice was regal but gentle at that moment, which made the atmosphere less tense and more grandiose. I accept your oath. Rise, Mance, Lord of House Rayder, Lord of Sea Dragon Point and Stony Shore. Enar finished, declaring Mance Rayder's titles in front of everyone. As for what his uncle would think about him granting Mance these fiefs, Enar didn't really care. Westeros belonged to House Targaryen. All the lands on that continent were theirs. In the future, the nobles would only have the right to administer the fiefs on his behalf. They could only own the castles and the surrounding lands. Other than that, everything belonged to him and House Targaryen. Of course, this would only work until the Great Crusade. In the future, the fiefdoms would be greatly expanded, and the noble houses would control planets. Some, like the great houses, would dominate entire solar systems. The noble houses of Planetos would spread across the galaxy, while Planetos would become the center of the Imperium. But that was for the future. In the present, Enar was about to begin his reconquest. At Enar's words, Mance stood up and greeted him like a vassal. Your Grace. Lord Mance. The two exchanged greetings. Enar didn't treat Mance with contempt or as someone less important. After all, the man had once been a king, and the status of king was not to be despised, as it was the source of his political power. The heir to Winterfell, Robb of House Stark, will arrive at Castle Black in a few days. He will act as representative of House Stark, and you will bow to him again. Only after that will you be recognized as a Lord of the North." Enar commented with a smile, and despite the pain of losing loved ones, the leaders of the free folk seemed more relaxed and even smiled. They had a home and could finally live as they should. Val, holding her nephew, looked at her sister's son and couldn't help but hug the child a little tighter. She never imagined that the last time she saw Della would actually be the last time she would see her sister's sweet smile and gentle gaze. "Val, I want you to take the name of my house as your own, and if I ever fall in the coming war, I want you to act as regent until Sanguinius can rule." Mance approached Val and spoke directly about his purpose. He knew that his chances of dying were incredibly high, as were those of all the men who would take part in the war. Val was the best choice he had should he die. Others might kill his son to take over his titles and fiefdoms. I was sure that some tribal leaders were unhappy with his decision to kneel, but no one dared to say anything to Enar present. Everyone still remembered how the dragon had saved their lives. Val looked at her sister's husband and nodded silently as she gently held her nephew, trying to get him to sleep, which proved futile. The baby seemed to have infinite energy. She swore she had never seen Sanguinius close his eyes and go to sleep, but she knew it was impossible. Val had seen a few babies in her life, and they all had one thing in common: constant sleep. Every baby slept most of the day. So she assumed that Sanguinius slept when she wasn't looking. What Val didn't know, however, was that she was incredibly wrong. Sanguinius had actually never slept since his premature birth. His special bond with the warp dimension nullified any need for sleep. This wasn't a problem at the moment, but as the little Primarch grew up, he would become more and more distanced from humanity until he finally reached his peak. "Hello, beautiful lady." Near Enar, Tormund greeted Leda with a big smile on his face, without hiding the flirtation in his words. Leda suppressed the irritation that was growing in her heart and stopped herself from cutting off the head of that savage who couldn't recognize the word no. She had never met such an irritating man in her entire life. And she was born in Dorne, the home of the most lustful men in the Seven Kingdoms. Even the most inconvenient Dornish man wouldn't come close to the level of irritation that Tormund caused him. The idiot constantly talked about the giant babies they would have and the endless nights of passion. Just imagining it made Leda feel a wave of revulsion. She was a bloody sword, not a woman. Enar watched the spectacle between Leda and Tormund with great interest. Of course, he knew that Tormund would never have a chance with Leda. Not because the woman was too proud, but because she valued the oaths of the royal guard above her own life. In Leda's mind, she was a sword and nothing more. Only protecting and serving Enar for all eternity could bring a smile to the lips of House Dane's Sword of the Morning. Apart from that, Enar really doubted that Tormund could even get her to look at him with the slightest bit of kindness. However, it was very interesting to see Tormund try, and Enar had to admit, the red-haired man certainly had guts. Few men were interested in someone stronger than themselves. Fixing his eyes on his great-uncle Eamon, Enar knew that the old man wanted to ask what was next. "What are we going to do, Your Grace?" Because they were in a place full of strangers, Eamon addressed Enar formally, not as a family member. "I'm staying at Castle Black until the Lords of the North arrive at Winterfell. While I'm here, I'll order all the checkpoints, as well as Castle Black, to be refurbished for the war to come." Enar commented in a calm tone, while observing the deplorable state of the fortress. Although the wall was a great help, he knew that the gigantic ice wall's days were numbered. It was inevitable. The wall would fall and with it, humanity's first line of defense. It wasn't that the wall wasn't strong, but the power of mortals couldn't compare to that of the gods. On a normal long night, the gods wouldn't intervene, but this was no normal long night. All the evil gods were personally involved in this war. No one wanted to see humanity grow, as this would allow the birth of the Chaos Gods, something completely unacceptable to the evil gods, who did not wish for the existence of being stronger than themselves. So the wall would fall one way or another. Nothing could stop the war that was to come. That's why Castle Black and the other Night's Watch checkpoints, such as the Shadow Tower and Eastwatch by the Sea, needed to be reinforced and refurbished for when the wall collapsed. "I'll send a raven to Commanders Ser Dennis Mallister and Cotter Pike." Eamon nodded and walked away with his aging body. The man wanted to help as much as he could, without any rest. Enar wanted him to rest. but he knew that Eamon wanted to give his all before what was to come. Perhaps that was the only thing he could do, since he was no longer fit to hold a blade. Honestly, Einar wanted Eamon to go through the blood ritual, but he was uncertain about the old man's survival. Eamon was so fragile that even a small amount of energy could cause irreparable damage. Nevertheless, Einar decided to try. He would talk to Eamon, and if the man wanted to, he would do anything to help him. Rob couldn't help but take a deep breath at the sight of the gigantic wall. He had heard the stories, but seeing it in person was something completely different. Just imagining that his ancestor had built such a masterpiece was enough to fill the air to Winterfell with pride. Incredible! I want to see the view from the top. The grandiose feeling Rob was experiencing disappeared the moment he looked down and saw Arya riding beside him. When we get back to Winterfell, you're going to spend a whole month locked up in a tower. And I personally will make sure that Septa teaches you to sew and indoctrinates you for days. Rob gave Arya a stern look. If he didn't discipline his sister now, she might gain even more courage to run away from home in the future. Arya's smile had never faded so quickly. She looked at her brother with a pleading look. To be forced to learn to sew and listen to the seven preach? She would rather throw herself from the tower and end her suffering once and for all. That wouldn't be a lesson, but a real mental torture session. Seeing her desperate expression, Rob nodded, satisfied. He just wanted to make sure that Arya understood that running away from home was not an option, especially for a girl. Arya, never run away from home again. This world isn't kind to girls. He stroked his sister's hair and spoke in a gentle tone. How many times had he seen his father cut off the heads of rapists? Dozens of times. Just imagining something like that happening to Arya made his mood darken. Arya nodded, but it was clear from the look on her face that she wasn't convinced by her brother's words. She was not a helpless lady, and she knew how to protect herself with the needle, the gift Einar had given her. She had trained in hiding and was confident that, at the slightest opportunity, she could kill a man. Spending her days in a castle, surrounded by jewels, expensive dresses and sugary cakes was perhaps every commoner girl's dream, but not hers. Arya wanted to explore. She wanted to know every corner of the world and live the life she chose, not be a lady destined for marriage and children. If Rob knew what was going through his sister's mind, he'd probably increase the punishment to 10 years, and he'd still think it was too little. Not that he was cruel, but as the eldest brother, he wanted the best for Arya. He wanted her to have a worthy destiny, a good husband, beautiful children, and in the end, a happy life. That was his sincere wish for all his siblings. Putting these thoughts aside, Rob focused on the gates of Castle Black, which were already open to welcome them. Waiting for them was an old man, too old for him to guess. But when he noticed the maester's necklace around his neck, Rob could assume that it was the maester of Castle Black. Looking into the old man's lilac eyes, Rob noticed a striking resemblance to those of Einar. "Welcome, heir of Winterfell. I am Aemon of House Targaryen, maester of Castle Black. I will escort you to the meeting place, where everyone is already awaiting your arrival." Aemon greeted Rob with a kind smile and then cast a curious glance at the girl riding with him. Rob was speechless when he discovered Aemon's identity. He opened his mouth, but couldn't answer immediately. "Incredible. You're like Einar. Who was your father?" Arya jumped off her horse, excited, and looked at Aemon curiously. Aemon couldn't help but laugh when he saw the girl's energy. "Little nature spirit," he greeted Arya with a smile before answering. "My father was Mikar, first of the name. And when I refused the throne, it was passed on to my brother, Aegon, fifth of his name." Arya suddenly stopped and stared, her eyes widening so much that they seemed about to pop out of their sockets. It wasn't just her who was shocked. Rob also displayed an incredulous expression. Refuse the throne? How many men would do that? His own father, Ned Stark, had refused the throne, as had Jon Arryn, but how many others would be indifferent to the greatest power in an entire continent? "You may call me Maester Aemon," he continued in a gentle tone, noticing the surprise on the young men's faces. "When I took my oaths, I stopped being a prince and gave up all my titles and possessions." Aemon gestured for them to follow him and began walking towards Castle Black Hall, his steps slow but steady. Rob and Arya looked at each other, still processing what they had just heard. After a brief silence, Robb spotted Ser Roderick Castle and, pulling himself together, spoke firmly. Ser Roderick, organize the supplies and weapons inside Castle Black. I will go to the meeting. Yes, my lord. Roderick nodded respectfully. With that, Robb took Arya's hand and entered the fortress. But as soon as he passed through the gates, he stopped abruptly, shocked by what he saw. In front of him, a giant wielded a huge axe, chopping wood with frightening ease. A log the size of a grown man looked like a simple toy in his colossal hands. This is one of the last giants of his kind, Aemon introduced the creature with a smile, recalling his own reaction to seeing him for the first time. Arya watched the giant with fascination and wondered if he could put her on his shoulders. If Robb knew about his sister's dangerous thoughts, he would have a heart attack and, without hesitation, lock her in a tower for the rest of her life. Putting the giant's presence aside, Robb turned his attention to understanding what had happened before his arrival. The war against the White Walkers and the Whites had already begun. And to his surprise, the king beyond the wall, Mance Rayder, had knelt before Enar, accepting him as his sovereign. Robb had countless questions, and Aemon, ever patient, answered them all, without hesitating to share everything he knew so far. On hearing that they had captured Whites to present to the Northern Lords, Robb felt more confident that he could get them to bend the knee to Enar without too much bloodshed. Although he knew that some bloodshed was inevitable. The Northern Lords were stubborn as stone, and no matter how terrifying dragon fire was, they wouldn't bend easily. Arya listened to everything with her eyes shining with excitement. She wanted to be invisible so she could spy on the Whites up close. Just imagining herself killing one, as her ancestors had done in the past, made her chest inflate with pride and excitement. Once again, if Robb knew of his sister's thoughts, he would have a tall tower built on an isolated island and lock her in, just so that the 6-year-old girl would learn, once and for all, never to have such dangerous ideas again. Arriving at Castle Black's hall, Robb saw that there were many people in the place, and sitting in the most important seat was Enar, with a relaxed posture in contrast to the severe atmosphere in the air. As he entered, Robb felt everyone's gaze fall on him. As heir to Winterfell, he didn't fear the stares, as he had already spoken in front of the Lords of the North countless times. Robb. Enar greeted his cousin with an amused look. You're right on time. Lord Mance will kneel for you and take your oath in the name of Lord Stark. Aren't you going to pour me a glass of wine, Your Grace? Robb asked with an incredulous tone, causing everyone around to burst into loud laughter. The tense atmosphere melted away as if it had never existed. Robb looked discreetly at Enar with admiration. He hoped to have this kind of skill when he was Lord of Winterfell. Observing those present, Robb arrived at Enar's side with Arya and spoke aloud. I am Robb of House Stark, heir to Winterfell and representative of the Lord of the North, Eddard of House Stark. Welcome to Castle Black, Lord Stark. Jeor stood up and greeted his liege successor, the Great Bear, Jeor Mormont. Robb greeted Jeor with a smile. He couldn't imagine that such an honorable man would have a son like Jorah, a slaver. Lord Stark. Mance stood up and respectfully greeted his future lord. Lord Mance. Robb, who already knew who Mance was through Aemon, greeted the king beyond the wall with equal respect. Enar smiled as he saw them greet each other and spoke aloud. Since Lord Stark has arrived, we will begin the ceremony. I like what's coming, Enar thought, watching Robb look at Val with a passionate gaze. I, Mance of House Rayder, Lord of Sea Dragon Point and Stony Shore, bend my knee and promise to honor my oath. When House Stark needs it, House Rayder will be there to fight alongside the Lord of Winterfell, Mance declared in a loud, clear tone, his voice not hiding the seriousness of the moment. After hearing Mance's oath, Robb stood up and spoke aloud. I, Robb of House Stark, heir of Winterfell and future guardian of the North, in the name of Enar of House Targaryen, first of his name, Knight of Caraxes, King of the Undulls, the Roynars and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm, accept your oath. May our homes have peace and prosperity. With Mance kneeling before Robb, the atmosphere became more restrained, and the hostility coming from the noble houses lessened slightly. Arya, who was eating a piece of bread, watched the whole scene and nodded. To her, it was natural that Mance had knelt down. In her eyes, the North belonged to House Stark, and House Raider becoming a vassal of House Stark was to be expected. However, Robb knew that Mance's fiefdoms were at least too large, so vast that they could easily form a small kingdom. He cast a disgruntled glance at Enar, who was sitting in the largest seat. In Robb's eyes, his brother was using the wildlings to prevent House Stark from completely dominating the north. Feeling Robb's gaze, Enar realized that his cousin had got it all wrong, but he didn't try to explain himself, especially in the presence of everyone. He had only granted those lands to Mance to avoid dissatisfaction among the free folk. There was no other intention behind it. Enar sat in the center, with Robb on his right and Mance on his left. The three most powerful men in the hall were talking in low voices. "Do you think House Stark will turn its back on House Targaryen, Your Grace?" Robb asked casually, as he sipped his wine. His blue eyes looked at Enar with obvious dissatisfaction. Not at all. But other places couldn't offer so much land without causing overpopulation and even more chaos. Besides, the other lords of the north wouldn't accept the free folk in their lands, Enar replied in an equally casual tone, looking at Robb. If it had been anyone else, Enar wouldn't have bothered to reply, but since it was Robb, he did, albeit with a slightly helpless look on his face. Robb's mood improved with Enar's words. As long as his brother wasn't being cautious with House Stark, any misunderstandings could be easily resolved. "So why is Arya with you?" Enar asked, watching the girl who was eating like there was no tomorrow. "She hid among the supplies. When we found her, she was devouring dried meat like a sneaky squirrel. As we were already far from Winterfell, I didn't want to delay the journey and brought her with me," Robb replied with a helpless expression, but with a smile on his lips. Enar looked at Arya and believed that she really could do something like that. The girl was impulsive and a bit crazy when it came to big adventures. "I'll love to see Eddard's expression when he sees his daughter again," Enar commented in an amused tone, making Robb roll his eyes, although he also smiled. "She'll be grounded for eternity," Robb said, glaring at his little sister. Arya, realizing that the two were talking, looked at them with confusion, while a few crumbs of bread were still around her mouth. She still had no idea of the cruel punishment that awaited her at Winterfell. "How long are you staying in Castle Black?" Robb asked with a serious expression, changing the subject. After hearing the reports about the war against the White Walkers and the White's army, he realized that the situation was more serious than he had imagined. 1 month. "Then I'm going back to Winterfell to bring those arrogant northern lords to their knees," Enar replied in a calm, casual tone. "Fortunately, you destroyed the Dreadfort. That will bring many lords to their knees without bloodshed, which spares us a lot of chaos," Robb said in a relieved tone. He, more than anyone, knew how the lords of the north acted and what their temperaments were. "What can I say? I'm amazing," Enar replied with a confident smile on his lips. Robb rolled his eyes at Enar's overconfidence, but didn't deny it. After all, he really was incredible. However, he couldn't help adding, "Try not to kill. Many are just stubborn, but they are good men." Enar was speechless, but remained silent. He didn't like rebels and considered himself incredibly merciful for not killing certain people. "I'll try, but don't expect me to do it. I'd rather kill everyone than suffer betrayal at a delicate moment." Robb nodded. He was pleased that Enar was at least trying. As for the rest, he just hoped that the Northern Lords would be more understanding. If they weren't, he would let fate decide. He had already done enough to help them. Mance watched the two of them chatting casually, and was a little confused by their union, considering the rumors about the birth of the young king. However, it wasn't his place to comment on anything. He remained silent, just eating and thinking about building his castle and city as quickly as possible. While Robb was drinking, he noticed an incredibly beautiful woman, with blonde hair and blue eyes, holding a baby with the same features. Mother and child, he assumed. However, he couldn't stop his heart from beating faster at the sight of such a graceful woman. Enar noticed this and couldn't help but flash an amused smile. Val of House Raider, sister of Mance's late wife. She is known as the Princess of the Wilds and is currently single and childless. Enar spoke in a casual tone, as if he hadn't noticed the growing interest in Robb's gaze. However, the playful smile on his lips told another story. Hearing Enar's words, Robb's blue eyes lit up slightly. He admitted to himself. He found the woman incredibly attractive, and her status was something not even his father could dispute. Besides, if he married Val, he could help make the savages more civilized. If Einar could hear Rob's thoughts, he would be speechless. He would never have imagined that his brother could fall in love so easily that he would consider marriage without having exchanged a single word with Val, and being the heir to House Stark to boot. But looking at Val, Einar understood why a boy of Rob's age would be so fascinated. The Princess of the Wild was indeed a sight for sore eyes. If she wore a silk costume from Mir, she could easily pass for a real princess. "Rob, if you keep staring at her so intently, you'll make her evaporate from the planet," Einar whispered, noticing his cousin's fixed gaze on the woman. Caught red-handed, Rob put on an embarrassed expression and tried to respond in a seemingly calm tone. "I was just looking at her a bit." Einar gave him a teasing look, not believing a single word that came out of the Winterfell heir's lips. "Good. I hear she has a lot of suitors, and you're not exactly tall and strong," said Einar, feigning relief as his lips curved into an amused smile. Rob felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. He had never imagined that words could hurt so much, but the mere thought of Val marrying another man made his stomach turn. A feeling of anger and competitiveness welled up in his chest. "I'm handsome, I'm heir to Winterfell, and I'll have ice, a legendary Valyrian steel sword. I'm a great match for marriage." The more he said it, the more confidence appeared on his face. How could he not fight for his first crush? Looking at the possible suitors, Rob felt his determination grow even more. The Redfish would be furious if Rob married Val, right? Einar muttered, with a look full of amusement and teasing. Just imagining Catelyn's expression when she heard who Rob wanted to marry, Einar quickly thought of a way to get Val and Rob to meet and marry as soon as possible. He wanted to laugh, but held back. No one could know about his nefarious plans. Besides, he was sure that Rob would thank him forever for helping him marry such a beautiful and incredible woman as Val. A month has passed quickly. Shadow Tower, Castle Black, and Eastwatch by the Sea have undergone an astonishing transformation. The reforms only finished so quickly because the free folk were paid with food to help with what was needed. Tens of thousands of people infinitely sped up the time it took to erect wooden walls and fortify the gates. However, around 60 to 70,000 savages were ready to set off towards the fief of Mance. Einar, Rob and Arya joined the march to Winterfell, where Mance would meet Eddard of House Stark and swear his oath again in the eyes of all the lords of the north. Who, by the way, were already at Winterfell at that very moment, just waiting for him to arrive. "Arya, do you want to come with me or Rob?" Einar asked as he put on his flying gloves. He looked at the 6-year-old girl wearing men's clothing. There was no hesitation in Arya's words. "With you." How could she miss the chance to fly on a dragon? She would probably kill herself with rage if she refused to fly on a dragon, something that perhaps every child in Westeros has thought of doing one day. Einar wasn't surprised by Arya's answer. If she refused, he would be shocked. Looking at Rob, who was chatting happily with Val, he felt that his efforts this month had paid off handsomely. Teaching Rob to woo Val had proved easier than expected, and the heir of Winterfell had quickly learned to compliment a woman without making her feel uncomfortable or too invasive. Sure, Rob might be in love with Val, but he was sure that Val wasn't in love with Rob. Val was a mature woman. How could she fall in love so easily? But that didn't matter in Einar's eyes. Companionship in his eyes was much more important than love. In science, infatuation doesn't last more than 3 years, and that feeling of euphoria and always wanting to be by your loved one's side gradually calms down. In the end, only love remains. You might say that love and infatuation are the same, but both are different. Passion is something selfish, always wanting the lover's attention or always being by his or her side. Love, however, is born of companionship through coexistence and the difficulties the couple faces over the years. That's why Val not being in love with Rob wasn't important in Einar's eyes. He would much rather Rob had a wife who would be with him for life than a passing passion. However, after seeing Val's reaction to Rob's flirtations, Einar knew that Val was also interested in Rob, although he didn't know if it was because of Rob's status or something else. "Rob, stop bothering Val and let's go." Einar shouted at Rob, who simply looked at him with a disgruntled look. Einar rolled his eyes and no longer cared about the heir to Winterfell. He hadn't expected Rob to be one of those friends who abandoned years of friendships for a woman. "Follow me." Einar spoke as he climbed over the iron netting that held the saddle in place. Arya looked at the dragon so closely with a look of admiration, and without any hesitation, followed Einar. As soon as Arya reached the saddle, she was picked up by Einar and placed in front of him. Leda positioned herself behind Einar, as she could leave her king alone again. Putting the belt around the three of them and closing it tightly, Einar spoke to Caraxes in High Valyrian. "Suvgan Caraxes." Under Arya's shocked eyes, the dragon stood up, and even though she was on the ground, she was at a very high height. Then the dragon began to walk, and with a loud flapping of its wings, it took off into the sky quickly. Looking down, Arya saw the free folk marching in a straight line and couldn't help but shout excitedly, "Faster!" Leda, behind Einar, twitched her lips abnormally. She really couldn't believe that there were people who enjoyed flying on a dragon and still asked to go faster. Einar couldn't help but laugh at Arya's words and decided to teach the little adventurer a lesson, making her feel the real danger. With the connection between man and dragon, Caraxes understood what his rider wanted and began to lean to the side, gradually turning in the air. Arya turned pale, and an expression of fear appeared on her face as the dragon simply stood upside down in the air. If it hadn't been for feeling Einar's arm behind her, the girl would have started screaming in fear a long time ago. Her expression of fear satisfied Einar and Leda, who secretly laughed at the brave girl. Although what he did was cruel, Einar thought it was an appropriate lesson. Under no circumstances could Arya try to ride Caraxes alone. He had no doubt that Caraxes would devour the girl in a rage, and she had to learn that Caraxes might seem calm, but he wasn't. He was cruel, sadistic, and had a very strong sense of humor. He was cruel, sadistic, and liked to devour corpses. After he felt that enough was enough, he asked Caraxes to stop maneuvering in the air, and the Crimson Dragon flew normally in the air, making the poor girl breathe a sigh of relief. Being upside down in the air was a terrible situation that she never wanted to experience again. "I'll never fly on a dragon again," Arya murmured with watery eyes, almost as if she was going to cry at any moment. But the girl showed a determined expression and didn't cry, even though she wanted to cry as loudly as possible at that moment. "Arya, when we get to Winterfell, I'm taking you on a special flight." Hearing her words, Einar flashed a gentle smile and spoke in an amused tone. Although he knew it was sadistic, he enjoyed seeing the look of fear on Arya's face. Every older brother liked to scare his younger brothers and sisters. Perhaps it was a natural part of the world. Arya's face paled at the mention of the special flight. She had an idea of what this special flight would be like, full of acrobatics and maneuvers in the air. If it had been before, she might have been excited, but after experiencing it for herself, she just wanted to get back on the ground and never get on a dragon again. "I'll pass. I'll learn to ride a horse." Arya showed an expression that she wasn't interested and spoke in a casual tone, trying to sound like she wasn't afraid, but just disinterested. "All right, horses are very interesting too." Einar definitely saw that she was lying, but didn't reveal her lie and acted along. Looking down, Einar saw the free folk marching over the King's Road, heading towards Winterfell. From there, these people would go to the Fief of Mance and start building the initial settlements for the construction of the city and castle. Winterfell Castle. Looking at the great hall full of lords and ladies of the north, Eddard looked inexpressive sitting on the throne of the Winter Kings. Ice, the Valyrian steel sword of House Stark, stood beside the throne with its imposing size and full of power. It wasn't hard to guess that a person would be cut in half with extreme ease by the sword. "Lord Stark, why have we been called so urgently? Is it about the war against Prince Targaryen across the sea?" Lady of House Mormont, Midge Mormont, asked with a worried tone. She had already received the news and couldn't help but show a troubled expression. She hadn't expected Lyanna to have a child with Rhaegar. On the one hand, she was happy that Lyanna's legacy still existed. On the other, she was disgusted that the fruit of her grape was still alive. When Midge spoke, all eyes focused on Eddard, waiting for his answer. It was obvious that everyone was ready for war when it came. They just needed the orders of the Lord of Winterfell and Protector of the North. Feeling the anxious glances towards war, Eddard felt a headache coming on. How could he tell these people that they were not going to fight against House Targaryen, but alongside it? However, after seeing everyone's expression, He knew that anything else would not be accepted by these lords and lattice. Some wanted revenge, others just wanted a good war, and some were undecided. Suddenly, the gates of the great hall opened and a young but powerful voice sounded throughout the place. Of course we're going to war, a war against House Baratheon and their supporters. All eyes turned to the tall boy with the golden white hair. He was wearing black clothes, but the red crest of the three-headed dragon was unmistakable to anyone present. Next to him was a woman in white armor with gray eyes, as well as a smaller girl whom everyone knew as Arya Stark. Meej looked at the boy, stunned. She hadn't imagined that the man they had just spoken about would appear in front of her at the same moment. Ignoring everyone's stares, Enar walked to the seat of the Winter Kings and, under Eddard's helpless gaze, sat down on the throne that only the lords of Winterfell could occupy, or their wives in the case of regency. Seeing Eddard cede the Winter Throne to Enar, all the Northern lords felt that something was incredibly wrong. It was almost as if Lord Stark was bending the knee to the boy. This frightened them for a moment. Faced with confused and incredulous looks from the Northern lords and ladies, Enar spoke in a calm tone. "Before we begin, I am Enar of House Targaryen, first of your name, son of Lady Lyanna of House Stark and Prince Rhaegar of House Targaryen." When his voice faded, a momentary silence followed. Before swords were drawn, axes raised to chop off heads and warhammers prepared to smash them. Greatjon, in particular, held his huge sword as if it were a toy. The blade was bigger than ice, the Valyrian steel sword of House Stark. "This is not your rightful place, fruit of grape." The Lord of the Last Hearth growled angrily, glaring at the arrogant Targaryen boy. Enar laughed and replied, "I don't remember asking permission to sit down, Lord Umber." He paused and then looked at Greatjon with a cold gaze. "And watch your words. I'll cut your head off if you ever accuse my father of being a grapist again. He married my mother under witness, and that was proven with evidence in the Old Town." Enar's words left everyone incredulous, which was understandable, given that they had fought a war to recover Lyanna, kidnapped by Rhaegar Targaryen. And why should we believe his words? Meej asked, analyzing Lyanna's son with a deep, penetrating gaze. "Don't you know it yourself, Lady Mormont?" Enar smiled, amused. "My mother was a wolf, and she was from the north. If someone tried to grape her, she would cut off the attacker's schlong and make him eat it." His words made many women on Bear Island nod. Meej, in particular, who had trained Lyanna to ride a horse, knew this better than anyone. She also remembered how Lyanna had taken part in the tournament of Harrenhal as the mysterious Knight of the Laughing Tree and competed halfway through the event, before having to flee on the orders of King Aerys II. Note, although the theory that Lyanna was the Knight of the Laughing Tree has not been confirmed, I prefer to believe it rather than the theory that Howland Reed took on this role. Rhaegar took part in the search for the mysterious knight, and it's possible that he met Lyanna while she was still changing clothes. This would make more sense for the development of their relationship and would better explain why Rhaegar crowned Lyanna Queen of Love and Beauty. That still doesn't prove anything, Greatjon muttered, raising his voice. His statement made those who were still undecided look at Enar with more hostility. "I lost my husband in the war that your despicable father and grandfather started. If you think I'm going to kneel before you, you're wrong. I'd rather burn in your dragon's flames than kneel to the cause of my husband's death." Barbary Dustin, wife of William Dustin, who had perished in the war 12 years ago, spoke with a cold and indifferent tone. "If you wish, I will reward Milady with fire. I will extinguish your husband's noble house, which so many lords and ladies of House Dustin have sweated, bled and given their lives to preserve." Enar showed no emotion at Lady Dustin's words. He stared at her, observing her mature beauty, and replied with an equally icy tone. Her words fell like a bucket of cold water on Barbary, abruptly snapping her out of the stupor of anger. And it wasn't just her who woke up. Silence spread through the hall as everyone processed the imminent threat of the destruction of their own homes. Enar cast a satisfied glance at the thoughtful expression on the faces of those present, and continued before their indecision dissipated. "I know that many have lost loved ones in the war. I too have lost important people. My grandfathers killed each other, my uncle died because of it, and my parents perished in the conflict, as did Lady Dustin's husband. My good mother, Queen Elia, was graped and then cut in half by Gregor Clegane's sword. My brother Aegon, who was only a baby, had his head smashed against the wall. Einar paused, letting his words sink into the minds of the Northern Lords. But we're not in a tournament to decide who lost the most. We have all suffered, and the dead will not return. His gaze, laden with sincerity, swept over every face in the hall. The young Targaryen's words struck a chord with many of the lords of the north, including Lady Barbary. One by one, they began to sit down, somber expressions dominating their faces as they remembered the loved ones they had lost. Then a man's voice broke the silence. He is the son of Lyanna and Rhaegar. Lord Stark and I were present when he was born. I saw with my own eyes when Lyanna declared that she was married to Rhaegar and begged Lord Stark to protect the boy. And so he did, raising him as a bastard for 12 long years, even if it tarnished his honor. Everyone turned their gaze to Howland Reed, the Lord of Greywater Watch. When they saw Einar sitting on the winter throne, they remembered the bastard boy they had seen before. Comparing them closely, they realized that it was indeed the same boy, which only confirmed that Howland was telling the truth. "So why did the war happen?" asked Meij, in a genuinely confused voice. "A conspiracy to destroy House Targaryen, orchestrated by the Faith of the Seven, the Order of the Maesters and Lords of the Great Houses," replied Einar, before continuing. "My father, Rhaegar, sent a letter to my grandfather Rickard warning him about the wedding. He gave it to Lisa Tully, but the letter never reached him. Instead, another letter, written by Hoster Tully, was delivered, saying that Lyanna had been taken to King's Landing." The meaning of Einar's words fell like a sharp blade on those present. Anger began to well up in everyone's hearts, even Eddard Stark's. He had married his daughter. He had married the daughter of the man responsible for the death of his father and brother. How could he not feel hatred? Freaking Southerners. Filthy traitors. They must all die and burn in the wrath of the old gods. The shouts echoed through the hall. Barbary snorted coldly and said, "I always said the Maesters were traitorous grey rats." She had always believed that she hadn't married Brandon Stark because of Whaleys, Rickard's Maester at Winterfell, who had convinced him to marry Brandon to Catelyn Tully. Now it all made sense. It had been a conspiracy all along. "I know you're angry. I'm even angrier. So I give you two options, kneel or perish. There is no third option." Einar spoke coldly, his eyes sweeping the hall, staring at the Northern Lords without hesitation. "Prove you're a real man and fight." Great John stood up and spoke aloud. He wasn't against kneeling, but he wanted to see if Einar was worthy. All the lords and ladies of the North nodded, their gazes fixed on the young Targaryen, waiting for his answer. Einar's answer came quietly, but clearly. He stepped down from his throne and drew his sword. "This sword is called Lady Lya. It is made of star steel and named after my mother." Einar took up a combat stance and declared, "Whoever the challenger is, step forward. I promise not to kill anyone who comes, but expect a few broken bones, or a hand." Lita wanted to fight in the king's place, but knowing the customs of the north, she stood still, watching everything with a calm, cold gaze, ready to defend Einar at the slightest sign of danger. The first to stand up against Einar was Robert of House Glover and heir presumptive to House Glover. Robert was tall, with a deeply wrinkled face and gray-brown hair. He wore chainmail under a red overcoat, and his scarlet cloak was fastened with a silver brooch in the shape of a chainmail cuff. The heir to Deepwood Mott carried an impeccably silver warhammer, as well as the symbol of House Glover. "Your Grace." Robert greeted Einar with a rough, gruff tone. "Lord Robert." Einar returned the greeting. Without exchanging any more words, they both advanced. Robert had confidence in his strength. His hammer could sink into an enemy's chest as if he were crushing a watermelon. But the moment blade and hammer collided, the heir to Deepwood Mott was violently pushed backwards. The scene caused astonishment among the Northern Lords. It was the first time they had seen a sword surpass a hammer in terms of strength. What would it take to accomplish such a feat? They assumed that the person would need to have the strength of a horse, but looking at Einar's relatively strong arms and apparently slim body, they couldn't imagine how someone with that complexion could possess such strength. Lord Stark fed the boy giant wolf's milk. Great John asked in disbelief. "He must have. He's 12 and already so tall." he could grow even taller. Meej looked at Enar with admiration. Whether it was her or any other lord of the north, everyone admired the strong, and Enar had proved to be powerful. With his earlier words, many lords had already put aside old resentments. As they talked, Enar advanced without waiting for Robet to react. To impress the northern lords, he used a rather barbaric method to bring down his opponent. He simply headbutted the air to Deepwood Motte. Bang! With a loud, dry sound, Robet felt his head shake before falling unconscious to the ground. Ha ha ha. Good fight. Enar the Powerful. The fight was short, but it satisfied the brutal and ferocious tastes of the northern lords. They liked fights like this, fast, brutal, and intense. Only this kind of confrontation could be called a fight in their eyes. Enar looked at the northern lords and spoke in a calm tone. Next. Great John was not intimidated by Enar's words and actions. He stood up and, with his long sword, walked towards the center of the great hall. Some servants dragged the unconscious Robet out and cleaned up the makeshift arena. I'm going to enjoy breaking a few bones in that handsome face. Great John spoke arrogantly, not caring about Enar's status. Since Lord Umber wants a brutal fight, let's fight with our fists, like our ancestors did. Throwing his sword at Leda, Enar spoke with a calm, indifferent tone. Great John was stunned for a moment, but then started laughing uncontrollably. Ha 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 ha. Very well, young king, let's fight with our fists, just like our ancestors. Passing his sword to his son, Small John, Great John spoke with a rough, animated tone. The lords and lattice of the north slammed their mugs full of beer on the tables, creating a lively rhythm full of excitement, while shouting words of encouragement. Give the young king a beating, make him learn the ways of the north. The young king was brought up in the north, you idiot. Who did you call an idiot, you stupid animal? Whether it was Great John or Enar, neither of them cared about the surrounding words. In an instant, they both advanced. Great John was about 2 meters tall, a gigantic man even by the standards of the north, where men and women were generally tall. However, despite his size, he was surprisingly fast and arrived in front of Enar in the blink of an eye. However, the scene of Enar being punched in the face didn't happen. Instead, Enar's fist hit Great John square in the jaw, sending teeth and saliva mixed with blood flying through the air. The man staggered, his eyes wide in shock. Then, under everyone's incredulous gaze, the blow was so powerful that Great John fell unconscious to the ground. Next. Enar said. Another man stood up. This time, it was Great John's son, Small John. Although he was called Small, he was as tall as his father, perhaps even taller. House Umber really did produce giant men. Enar knew that House Umber had giant blood, although he preferred to forget how this lineage was conquered. Believe me, the giant women were as hairy as the males of the species, and had such ugly faces that it was hard to imagine how the male giants could consider them beautiful. Even so, Enar admired the ancestor of House Umber for having done the impossible, sleeping with a female giant and, what's more, fathering a child with her. When my father wakes up, I'll say that I defeated the enemy that defeated him. Small John spoke with an arrogant tone, just like his father. No one had any doubt that he was, in fact, Great John's son. Father and son resembled each other as much as could be expected. Sword or fist? Enar asked curiously. He was prepared to defeat all the northern lords, and if necessary, even the lattice, should they wish to fight. Fist. It's been a while since I've had a real fight. Small John replied, popping his stiff shoulder as he walked towards Enar with a big smile, showing off his teeth. Enar smiled back. It's been a while since I had a good fight either. The last one was against Khal Drogo, the man who commanded the largest Khalasar of his time, with 100,000 warriors. I defeated him in front of his people and cut off his head. Enar's words won the admiration of the men present. Facing an army of 100,000 men was no ordinary feat, and surely, that fight deserved to be recorded in the books. The Second Field of Fire. I've heard of it. Small John commented with an excited smile. Just imagining facing someone like that made his blood boil with excitement. Enar smiled and assumed a fighting stance, like an experienced boxer. He advanced without giving his enemy time to react, shortening the distance in an instant. Enar's first punch hit Small John in the chest, taking his breath away. The second punch hit his shoulder, followed by the dry sound of bones breaking. The third blow caught the left side of Small John's body. Like his father, he fell to the ground, like Goliath before David. Next, Enar said with a calm tone, as if he had done something simple and ordinary. However, the Northern Lords showed no fear in the face of Enar's consecutive victories. On the contrary, it made them even more excited. Whoever defeated the young king would gain all the prestige he had been accumulating. How could that not excite them? So despite Enar's quick and absolute victories, the lords were only more motivated. What followed was simple, brutal, and physical. One by one, the Northern Lords were taken down, falling unconscious to the ground. Enar showed no weakness in his attacks, breaking bones, teeth, hands, and arms. The atmosphere became more and more intense with his victories. Every time a lord fell, the audience cheered. 2 hours later, all the Northern Lords were awake and didn't seem to care about their injuries. When Eddard saw this, he breathed a sigh of relief. Things had gone more smoothly than he had expected. There had been no deaths, just a lot of broken bones. The ground was marked with blood and missing teeth. The Lord of Winterfell rose from his seat and attracted everyone's attention. Then, under the watchful gaze of the crowd, Eddard knelt before Enar and swore his oath. In the name of the old and new gods, I, Eddard of House Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Guardian of the North, do solemnly swear by my ancestors that I will fight alongside House Targaryen against their enemies. I will respect their laws and rule the North in their name, just as my children will, and their children's children. When Eddard knelt, all the lords of the North followed suit. House Umber, House Karstark, House Manderly, House Reed, House Mormont. One by one, all the noble houses of the North bent the knee. Enar had convinced them that he was not a weak man and that he could lead them to victory on the battlefield. The young king watched everyone kneel before him and just smiled, thinking, "I'm coming, Robert. And I'll fight you head-on." 296 BC, 14th year of the reign of King Robert I of House Baratheon. North, Winterfell Castle. Enar, in one of the castle towers, was sitting in a chair as he watched the troops gathering outside Winterfell. The 14-year-old, measuring 2 meters and 20 centimeters, was taller than countless humans on the planet. Behind him, Leda, with her impressive 2-meter height, stood loyally by her king's side. "Lord Stark has asked which place will be attacked first, Your Grace." Leda asked the question with a calm, cold tone, while lightning could be seen dancing in her pupils. "The valley." Enar replied with a calm expression. His voice was slightly cold, but nothing that disturbed the atmosphere around him. Leda didn't question why attack the valley first. Enar's orders were absolute for her. If he wanted to go directly to King's Landing, she would open the way for him. "How are we doing with Mance?" Enar asked curiously. "The Horned Castle has been erected at Sea Dragon Point. The city around the castle is gradually stabilizing, and House Stark no longer needs to send as much food as before." Leda replied, remembering the report she had received. She relied on Sansa to help her with these matters, which relieved the pressure on her. Especially after the Maester of Winterfell, Luwin, had mysteriously died in an accident falling down the stairs, things had become a little complicated for managing House Stark. However, with Sansa's help, Leda managed to stabilize Winterfell's finances. And believe me, it was the women who carried out this task, while the lords preferred to relax and just act as judges in cases of crime in their own fiefdoms. That's why Mace Tyrell and Tywin Lannister were exceptions. They both tightly controlled their finances, without bothering to delegate this work, which was generally considered tedious. Note, I wish I was a nobleman so I didn't have to do income tax. Castellans could help, but this was more common in the south, where people were better educated. In the north, even the noble houses didn't value knowledge as much. Perhaps only House Stark and House Manderly really had servants who could do mathematical equations. Enar nodded, satisfied, remembering that the inexperienced savages hadn't made the transition difficult by moving to Sea Dragon Point and Stony Shore. Although some still fled and hid in the northern forests to continue their nomadic lives, this was a small minority of less than 1,000 men and women. My family will arrive in Porto Branco in a few days with our fleet of ships and my Red Legion. Einar commented, looking to the future. Unlike a year and a half ago, when there were millions of possibilities, now the number had grown to billions. Instead of decreasing with the passage of time, the possibilities had increased dramatically. The reason for this was very simple: any decision he made could change fate accordingly. Those billions of timelines were merely the result of Einar's choices. Sometimes he had to think for days to make the right decision, which posed a great danger. But everything came with a price, and he wasn't unhappy about it. He already had a lot. He couldn't complain about the price that came with his powers. Yes, I'll have the Queen's quarters prepared. Leda replied with an indifferent tone. Her eyes lit up at the mention that the entire court of Essos was arriving in Westeros. The reconquest was ready, and they would begin the march to the Vale. Your Grace, what about the Riverlands? Leda asked with a touch of caution in her voice. The Riverlands were a delicate subject in Winterfell. Although everyone already knew the fate that awaited House Tully, destruction. Hoster Tully will feel the despair of seeing all his vassals betray him. And when he is alone, isolated in the castle of Riverrun, he and his cursed fortress will be melted into lava. Just like Harren the Black in Harrenhal. Einar pronounced Hoster Tully's fate with indifference. Traitors should receive the punishment they deserve: death. Hoster Tully's death was something he had already planned. Just as House Hor fell and House Tully rose to Lord Paramount thanks to Aegon the Conqueror, now House Tully would fall like Hor. As for putting another noble house in the place of House Tully, Einar didn't plan to do that. All the Riverlands would be placed under the possession of the crown, as would all the 7 kingdoms. In the future, there would no longer be such a strong sense of nationalism among the kingdoms. There would only be the Imperium, and nothing else. These grandiose reforms would make many furious, and several noble houses would rebel. But Einar wasn't exactly worried about that. There were plenty of other people willing to accept the new reality and become the next generation of nobles. For the houses that didn't adapt, only oblivion and extinction would be their ultimate fate. He would show no mercy to rebels and traitorous noble houses. Suddenly, just as Einar was about to say something, he heard someone knocking on the door. Gesturing for Leda to open it, he looked calmly at the red-haired woman who appeared before him as soon as the door was opened. Catelyn Stark, born Tully. The woman looked as beautiful as the last time he had seen her, but she was thinner and slightly paler, a sign that she had not been eating well. Your Grace. Catelyn greeted Einar with an etiquette that would make many ladies stare. Lady Stark. Einar returned the greeting and gestured for her to sit down in front of him in a beautifully crafted chair. But Catelyn didn't move, and instead of sitting, she knelt before Einar. I come to your Grace with a request. Einar looked at the woman kneeling in front of him with disinterest. He wasn't petty enough to hurt or even order Catelyn's murder, even if the woman had made his childhood worthy of being called a living hell. I'm listening, Lady Stark. Einar spoke with a calm tone. Spare my father's life. House Tully is loyal to House Targaryen. Catelyn didn't dare raise her face and spoke her words with her head bowed. Her voice was tinged with pleading and sincerity. Hearing Catelyn's request, Einar's eyes gradually grew colder. However, he spoke calmly. What is the motto of House Tully, Lady Catelyn? Family, duty and honor. Catelyn didn't hesitate to answer. She was proud of her family's motto. How did House Tully come to power? Einar asked again. By aiding in the conquests of the Riverlands and the destruction of House Hor. Catelyn answered again, without any hesitation. So tell me, why did your Lord Father, Hoster Tully, conspire with others to overthrow House Targaryen? Einar asked. His voice might have sounded calm, but that seemingly calm voice sent shivers through Catelyn's body. It felt like her body was warning her of the imminent danger. She bowed even lower, her forehead touching the ground. But despite this, she didn't hesitate to answer. My father. Yes, your father. Einar whispered. He wanted you or your sister to be queens. But whether it was Jon Arryn or Eddard Stark, they both refused the throne, which frustrated your dear father's plans. Tell me, Caitlin, if you were in my place, would you spare Hoster Tully's life? One of the men who orchestrated the war 14 years ago, which caused the death of my family. Einar spoke without any impatience. He wasn't surprised that Caitlin had come to him to ask him to spare her father's life. It was normal for a son or daughter to beg for their father and mother. Any child who had kind parents would do that. It was completely normal. But that didn't mean that Einar would show mercy. Hoster Tully showed no mercy when he orchestrated the deaths of his grandfather and uncle, nor when he lied to Eddard Stark, causing even more deaths. I will kill your father, cut off his bloody traitor's head and destroy House Tully. Einar spoke with a gentle tone. Just as House Tully rose with the help of House Targaryen, House Tully will fall for House Targaryen. Einar's words shot like arrows through Caitlyn's heart. She wanted to open her mouth and beg again, but the words never left her tightly pressed lips. Rising, she curtsied and walked to the exit of the room. Looking at the woman's desolate face, Einar showed nothing but disinterest. He had no interest in kicking a dead dog like Caitlyn. Caitlyn, this is the last time we will meet. Do not appear in front of me again. You are forbidden to leave Winterfell for the rest of your life. Before she left, Einar spoke with a cold tone. He wouldn't kill Caitlyn for her children, but that didn't mean he wanted to see her again. Caitlyn didn't answer and walked straight out of the tower room, disappearing from Einar and Leda's sight. I thought your grace was going to kill her. Leda was sure that Einar would kill Caitlyn when the woman begged for her father's life. She would have liked to have seen the scene, after all, because of Caitlyn, her mother, Ashera didn't marry Eddard. I almost killed her, but I stopped myself. Einar replied in a calm tone. Let's go. Einar said, getting up from her chair. Everyone is waiting for me. Narrow Sea. An imposing fleet was cutting through the voracious waves of the Narrow Sea. Made up of almost 1,000 ships crammed with soldiers, provisions and supplies for the war, the armada stretched over an area of almost 12 kilometers. Each ship proudly bore the coat of arms of a three-headed dragon on a black background. The coat of arms of House Targaryen. On board the Black Dragon, Riella observed the grandeur of the fleet. Her eyes roamed over the horizon, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't see the end of the fleet. A sigh escaped her lips. The sight was simply overwhelming. However, his attention was soon diverted when his youngest daughter's voice echoed next to him. Mother, I don't want to go to White Haber. The Dowager Queen turned to Daenerys, frowning slightly. Why? She asked in surprise. Until then, her daughter had been just as anxious as Visenya to meet Einar again. But now, there she was, saying she didn't want to go. I want to conquer Dragonstone. Daenerys answered without hesitation. At 13, after a year and a half, she had grown. She was now about 1 meter and 57. Although she was still small, she was already showing signs of maturity. Note, I know the age isn't right, but leave it at 13 anyway. Daenerys' words made Riella frown even more. I know you want to impress Einar, but the Dragonstone isn't that important at the moment. Her voice came out persuasive, but it didn't seem to have any effect. No. Daenerys refused her mother's suggestion without hesitation. I'm going to conquer Dragonstone. It's essential that everyone knows we're back. And nothing better than to start there. Her tone was firm, resolute. Once I've conquered Dragon Rock, I'll summon all the noble houses of Blackwater Bay and make them kneel before me. Riella sighed, feeling a twinge of headache. Her daughter's determined expression made it clear that there was no point in insisting. Refuse? How could she refuse Daenerys' order? She was the king's grandmother, yes, but Daenerys was the king's wife. As queen, her right took precedence even over that of a crown prince or princess. Riella knew that Daenerys wasn't asking for permission, just informing her that she was about to leave. Snorting coldly, the Dowager Queen couldn't contain her irritation. If you want to go, go. You don't have to tell me. Visenya approached the two, about to speak, but soon noticed the tension in the air. What's going on? She asked curiously. It was rare to see her mother and sister arguing so seriously. Daenerys wants to conquer Dragonstone. Riella replied, still irritated by her daughter's stubbornness. For her, the most important thing was to reach the north with the troops and the dragons, and any deviation from the plan was reckless. Visenya understood the reason for the argument almost immediately. However, to Riella's surprise, her eldest daughter didn't take her side this time. Daenerys is a queen and a dragon rider. She has the right to go where she wants. Her tone was carefree, almost casual. If she hadn't been so anxious to meet Enar again, Visenya herself would have accompanied Daenerys on her conquest of Dragonstone. Daenerys' victorious smile only made Riella frown even more. "You've both grown up and now you don't want to listen to me anymore," she muttered, dissatisfied, a touch of sadness showing in her voice. "Don't be sad, Mom." Visenya tried to console her. "Daenerys and I just want to do something on our own. If I wasn't so anxious to see Enar, I'd go with her too." Riella understood her daughter's desire for independence, but she couldn't help feeling left behind. For the first time in decades, she felt like a powerless queen again, unable to influence her own family's decisions. Realizing this, Daenerys softened her expression and took her mother's hand. "Don't worry, Mother. When I conquer Dragonstone and bend all the noble houses of Blackwater Bay, I'll go north with them by my side." Visenya, however, was still cautious. "Take care of yourself. Don't do anything stupid." Visenya warned her sister. She knew Daenerys was fearless, but the world was treacherous. The lessons of Dorne, Rhaenys Eye, and Merax's served as a constant warning to them all. After a brief pause, Visenya added, "I will send 20 ships with the Sardaukar." He remembered Enar's private army, a group of elite warriors who had proved their worth in the battle against the Slavers' Bay force. Those who survived the baptism of fire had become veritable war machines. Although she wasn't allowed to control the Sardaukar, she knew that Titus and Sigismund wouldn't mind sending some Sardaukar to protect and help Daenerys conquer and control Dragonstone. "Thank you, sister." Daenerys thanked him with a sweet smile. Visenya's trust in her made her full of confidence and determination. Suddenly, a shadow passed above them, causing the three women to lift their faces and look up into the sky, where 4 winged figures could be seen flying above the ships. There were 4 dragons, the largest of which was about 15 meters long. Note, Moonfire is the size of sea smoke after the time jump. Balerion is a little smaller, at 12 meters long. Syrax is 10 meters long and Vermithor is slightly larger at 11 meters long. Of the 4 dragons, 2 were male, Balerion and Vermithor, and 2 were female, Moonfire and Syrax. Balerion was by far the scariest with his dark color and reddish scales at the tips. The dragon was extremely temperamental and capable of hurting people at the slightest feeling of anger. Vermithor, unexpectedly, was grumpy like an old man and loved to sleep. Syrax, the fastest of the 4th dragons, was a true queen of the skies and, like her rider, a voracious warrior. Moonfire, the largest of the 4, was the most agile and could perform real miracles in the air. As if sensing Daenerys' desire for flight and war, Balerion let out a roar and lowered his altitude, passing dangerously close to the ship. "Be careful and don't hesitate to run if anything goes wrong." Seeing Daenerys putting on her gloves to ride the dragon, Visenya warned her sister again. "There was little need to worry. When you return to the north, Enar will punish you." Visenya added with a laugh as her cheeks took on a particularly noticeable red hue given her fair skin. "You'll like it, apparently." Daenerys commented with a hint of sarcasm, seeing Visenya's red cheeks. She knew her sister had some quirks in bed, but she didn't comment too much. Visenya glared at Daenerys, but as the older sister, she acted maturely and ignored her provocative words. Half an hour later, 20 of the 1,000 ships broke away from the main fleet and veered off the course that was destined to reach the north. Watching the ship with Daenerys disappear from her sight, Riella couldn't help but let out a helpless sigh. As her daughters grew up, she noticed that they were both becoming more and more independent. Especially Daenerys. She learned that the girl had already killed and tortured some prisoners to seek information. She didn't know much, only that her daughter commanded the entire network of Enar spies, known as the Emperor's Daughters, an order of female assassins and spies. However, Riella felt that this job was changing her daughter, making her mature much faster than she would have liked. If possible, She would have liked Daenerys to be as sweet and innocent a girl as any princess, but it was impossible given the circumstances in which her family grew up in exile. Looking at the fleet of ships moving away, Daenerys smiled. Conquering Dragonstone wasn't something she decided on impulse, but after receiving the information that Dragonstone was practically empty with only a few hundred defenders, she wanted to conquer Dragonstone herself. Suddenly, Daenerys noticed a small island and ordered the small fleet of 20 ships to approach the island. She would use the island to mount Balerion and fly towards Dragonstone, conquering it with fire and blood. As for what she would do with Stannis' wife and her daughter, Daenerys hadn't made up her mind yet, but as long as they were both redeemed, she would ensure their safety. After all, at least the girl was her cousin. 9-year-old Shireen Baratheon was reading a book in her room. The girl had the features of her father and mother, her father's square, protruding chin, and her mother's large ears. She wasn't pretty, but her blue eyes were particularly innocent and beautiful. She wore a brown dress while resting the book on her thighs. The left side of her face and a large part of her neck was cracked and gray. It was a terrible disease called grayscale, a disease that can leave the flesh stiff and dead, and the skin cracked and scaly, stained black and gray and stone-like to the touch. As Shireen continued to read, she heard a strange sound. It sounded like a long, distant guttural sound accompanied by the sound of flapping wings. Curious about the sound, she put the book aside and made her way to the balcony of her room. Her curiosity turned to a morbid pallor when she saw the black and red creature flying in the sky. On the horizon, 20 ships with black sails bearing the coat of arms of House Targaryen were approaching Dragonstone. Shireen didn't even need to inform them that they were under attack. As the bell began to ring loudly and reverberating, all the guards were mobilized in an instant. Riding Balerion, Daenerys couldn't help but stare at House Targaryen's ancestral castle with a look of fascination. The whole structure looked like a dragon made of black stone, erected under a lonely hill with ancient magic from ancient Valyria. She was determined to bring the dragon stone back to her family before the reconquest began. Suddenly, Daenerys noticed the guards under the castle walls, all holding spears and pointing scorpions in her direction. Daenerys smiled at the sight of those weapons used to kill dragons. Although they only worked on young dragons like Balerion, her own dragon was wearing armor, protecting the sensitive and vital parts of the dragon. As Enar had taught her, she would gain altitude and then fly downwards at great speed, raining fire down from the sky on her enemies, then go up again, repeating the process until there were no enemies left alive. That's what Daenerys did. Balerion descended from the sky at great speed, like a black meteor crossing the heavens. Daenerys felt her hair flutter violently against the wind as the dragon plunged towards the ground. She narrowed her eyes, narrowing her vision to see more clearly, and when she was close to the castle walls, she ordered, "Dracarys." At Daenerys' command, Balerion roared and spat black and red flames at the guards on the walls. The Mother of Dragons had targeted the scorpions, destroying the most dangerous weapons first. Screams were heard as men ran with their bodies engulfed in the dragon's flames, some rolling on the ground in an attempt to stop the fire, while others fell from the walls and died soon after. Daenerys didn't show much emotion at the scene before her and regained altitude before repeating the same process as before, destroying all the guards on the walls. In a medieval world, having a dragon meant that a castle was no longer a war fortress, but a stationary target ready to be shot down at any moment. No matter how many giant arrows the scorpions fired, the chance of hitting a target flying through the air extremely fast was as slim as a sniper trying to hit a moving target's head. An almost impossible mission, even for the most experienced snipers. By the time the scorpion's arrows shot out, Balerion was already tens or hundreds of meters away. How could something like that hit a dragon? In the end, after half an hour, there were no more men on the walls and House Targaryen's fleet had already docked at the port of Dragonstone. Curiously, there was no attack from the locals who were descendants of Valyria, with blonde or platinum hair, blue or lilac eyes. Daenerys made Balerion land not far from the small village on Dragonstone, where the Sardaukar were disembarking. She looked at Enar's private army with a curious eye. Although it wasn't the first time she had seen them, their curious appearance still aroused her curiosity. The Sardaukar wore long white and gold robes, and you could see nothing but their eyes beneath their golden helmets. They were silent and possessed an aura capable of frightening any normal adult. "Surround the castle. I will demand the surrender of Dragonstone, or I will burn everyone inside the castle without any hesitation," Daenerys ordered as she looked at the army called the Golden Horde by the people of Essos. That was a lie. Valyrian still didn't have as much power as Valyrian the Black Dread, but the people inside Dragonstone didn't know that fact. After all, a dragon hadn't appeared in Westeros for hundreds of years. What people knew about dragons came from exaggerated stories and tales spread among the commoners. Looking at the army before her, as far as Daenerys knew, half of the Sardaukar were unsullied who had been given to Enar by an important nobleman from Slaver's Bay, a nobleman she didn't care to remember the name of, as she hated anyone with slaves. These unsullied became the Sardaukar and eventually became human again. Although they had lost certain skills with discipline and the ability to kill a baby without any hesitation, they made up for it with indomitable determination and a sense of loyalty to Enar. Inside Dragonstone, Celis Baratheon, née Florent, was sitting on a black throne in the shape of a dragon. Shireen could be seen on her lap. The woman was protecting her daughter even at this moment. "Axel, how are we dealing with the invasion?" Celis asked with a worried tone. The woman was visibly pale. She had personally seen guards being burned alive, and their screams still seemed to ring in her mind. "We have 20 men left, and the other side has about 1,000 men and 200 men. Axel Florent, chaplain of Dragonstone, serving his nephew, Stannis Baratheon, replied with an equally pale expression. Nobody wanted to die, and Axel was no different. If possible, he wanted to guard the castle until reinforcements arrived from King's Landing, but this was no ordinary invasion. The other side had a dragon and could storm the castle at any time. The only reason they weren't dead was because the enemy wanted them to surrender. "They're asking us to surrender or we'll burn in dragon fire." Axel spoke with a tense tone, but continued speaking. "Queen Daenerys I of House Targaryen has said that as long as Dragonstone opens its gates for her arrival, she will not harm anyone, not even Lady Celis or her cousin, Lady Shireen." Celis didn't answer and asked something, looking straight into Axel's eyes. "Is there any chance of us winning?" Axel hesitated, but answered. "There's a small chance, but they're minimal. We can take Queen Daenerys hostage and buy time, but that's almost impossible with a dragon and an army that will follow her when the gates open." Closing her eyes tightly, Celis hugged her daughter tighter and let out a sigh. Dragonstone wasn't as important as Shireen. "Open the gates, we surrender." Opening her eyes, Celis spoke with a weary tone. She knew she would be considered a traitor when the news reached King's Landing, but she didn't care. At least she and her daughter would be safe. The queen calling Shireen cousin showed that she recognized the blood bond between them. And the fate of the murderer of relatives was cruel. Shireen had a curious look in her eyes. Knowing that it was her cousin who was the dragon rider made her eyes sparkle. In her eyes, she had a chance to see the dragon up close and even win a dragon for herself. The innocent girl didn't know that this was impossible. But as Shireen had thought, she did have a chance of bonding with a dragon, although the chances were almost nil given the 4-generation lineage separating her from Rael Targaryen, grandmother of Robert, Stannis, and Renly. With Celis' decision, the gates of Dragonstone were opened and the Sardaukar advanced, protecting Daenerys in their midst. Valyrian flew above them all, looking at anyone with a particularly fierce gaze. "Welcome to Dragonstone, Queen Daenerys." Celis greeted Daenerys with an unpleasant expression. After all, no matter how kind Daenerys had been to preserve her and her daughter's lives, it didn't change the fact that no one would want their castle invaded by anyone. "Lady Baratheon, I hope you're in good health." Daenerys greeted Celis back with a kind and warm gaze, as if they had been friends for a long time. Looking at the black throne, which seemed to protrude from the ground, Daenerys walked with her head held high and sat down. She observed the throne room, filled with Sardaukar, with an amused look. She could see that everyone was protecting her zealously, even gently. Her lilac eyes fell on her cousin, little Shireen Baratheon. Honestly, there was no indication that they were related. Pretty? Although Daenerys didn't want to criticize her, she definitely didn't think she was pretty, but her innocent blue eyes made her look adorable. "Hello, cousin." Daenerys ignored Celis and greeted Shireen with a sweet, gentle smile. "Hello, Queen Daenerys." Unlike Daenerys, who could call her casually, Shireen knew she couldn't do the same. Her mother had taught her to be respectful to royalty. "You two needn't worry. Your safety will not be violated, and unlike my cousin, your father, I will not kill my relatives." Perhaps noticing that they were both still slightly tense with so many soldiers around, Daenerys spoke in a comfortable, unhurried tone. The feeling of conquest in her heart made her extremely satisfied and full of vanity for having taken Dragonstone so easily. Even if reinforcements arrived from King's Landing, she was confident of holding the ancestral castle of House Targaryen until Enar arrived with Caraxes. Celis' body relaxed at Daenerys' words, and although she didn't want to, she felt it appropriate to call Robert a kinslayer. After all, Robert and Rhaegar were very close cousins. Robert's own father, Lord Steffan Baratheon, had been a close friend of Aerys too. "Thank you for your kindness, Queen." Celis bowed and ordered Shireen to do the same. Even though they had become hostages, she could see that Daenerys was keeping her promise not to hurt them. Daenerys nodded and spoke with a regal tone, worthy of a queen. "Call the Maester of Dragonstone." About 10 minutes later, an old man wearing a gray tunic and a large metal necklace appeared in the throne room. He walked slowly and with a slight limp. Beside him, there was a young man wearing a similar robe, with a metal necklace just like the old man. "Maester Cresson and my successor, Maester Pylus, your grace." Cresson looked first at Celis and Shireen. When he saw that they were both safe and in good condition, without any injuries, he turned to Daenerys and spoke in a respectful tone. "Send ravens to all the noble houses of Blackwater Bay. Summon them to kneel before me and retake their oaths to House Targaryen." Daenerys looked at them both and spoke with an indifferent tone. Her voice was stern and slightly cold, demonstrating her clear dislike of the Maesters. As essentially the master of the Whisperers of Enar, she knew secrets that many would never know. Her husband had told her of countless events, from the conquest of Aegon to the present day. Suspicious fires have destroyed books on blood and fire magic over the centuries, as well as the deaths of countless babies, including all of Daenerys' brothers and sisters who were born and died in the Red Keep. All orchestrated by the Order of the Maesters and the Faith of the Seven. Just the thought of her brothers and sisters dying without being able to know the beauty of the world made Daenerys want to kill them both at that very moment. As for the claim that it was normal for incestuous babies to die, Daenerys laughed scornfully. Valyria had existed for 5,000 years. If incest really was such a problem, the most powerful empire the world had ever known wouldn't have lasted 100 years. But it lasted for 5 millennia, and instead of wasting away due to blood defects, its children gained powers through blood magic and could even live longer than any normal human. The death of hundreds of babies from House Targaryen was unnatural, let alone inevitable. Perhaps sensing her coldness and antipathy, Cresson was confused, but he knew that the queen in front of him probably didn't like Maesters. He feared for the fate of Old Town, although he didn't understand why the Targaryen queen harbored this aversion. If Daenerys knew of Cresson's thoughts, she wouldn't be surprised. With such a grand and cruel plan, neither the Church nor the Order of Maesters would share such information with many people. This kind of conspiracy could crumble the foundations of the faith and the Order itself in the eyes of all commoners and noble houses. "Yes, Your Grace. I will send the ravens immediately." Despite his confusion, Cresson did not hesitate to obey Daenerys' orders. Daenerys, however, would not let the Maester act unsupervised. She gestured for two Sardaukar to remain at Cresson and his successor's side at all times. As soon as Cresson left the throne room, he didn't care to be overheard and looking at Pylus with a semblance of regret, muttered, "The order sent you at a very bad time, child." "It's all right, Brother Cresson. I'll show you that not all Maesters are bad." Pylus, a young man of just over 20, spoke in a gentle tone, remembering the image of Daenerys sitting on the stone throne. Honestly, his heart beat faster as he contemplated how beautiful she was. How could Cresson, almost 80 years old, not have noticed that look on Pylus' face? He knew how to recognize admiration and fascination. After all, he had once been young himself. But to harbor such feelings for someone like Daenerys was something a Maester shouldn't even dare to consider. However, Cresson said nothing to alert Pylus. Not while they were constantly watched by the Queen's guards. He just prayed that the gods would grant Pylus' young mind a little clarity and that he would forget this feeling. Unrequited love was one of the worst pains a man could suffer, and when it came to a beautiful queen, this feeling could drive Pylus to his death. Cresson had heard and read reports about Enar Targaryen and his dragon Caraxes. It wasn't just him who read these reports. Practically every maester did, and they were curious what method Enar had used to hatch the dragon egg, which was apparently supposed to be petrified after hundreds of years. After all, there were no living dragons in the world, and the dragon egg could only have come from one of the dragons during the Dance of the Dragons. Along with his report, there was some information about King Targaryen's personality, and they knew that he was not a merciful man, which could be seen when Enar Targaryen had burned tens of thousands of people alive. What would such a man think when he discovered the admiration Pylus felt for his wife? Cresson assumed that Pylus would die in a very painful way, so he prayed that Pylus would forget that feeling and focus on staying alive. Driftmark, home of House Velaryon. Looking at the letter that had arrived at the castle, Montford Velaryon smiled with satisfaction. Orain, summon our vassals and fleets. We are going to Dragonstone to kneel before Queen Daenerys I Targaryen, wife of King Enar I Targaryen. Brother, what about Lord Stannis? Orain couldn't help asking with a curious tone. May he burn in dragon fire along with all of House Baratheon. Montford spoke with a cold tone. In those 14 years, if there was one house that had become poorer and poorer, it was House Velaryon. Whether it was Robert or Stannis, both had suppressed House Velaryon with all their might. Not only did House Velaryon have to pay heavy taxes to the crown and to Stannis at Dragonstone, it couldn't build any more ships than necessary. It had few ships for trade and even fewer warships, especially when Queen Riella was fleeing to Essos. The fleet escorting the queen and the princesses had sunk in the terrible storm, leaving House Velaryon with even fewer ships. With the rise of Enar, Montford saw that House Velaryon could rise again. Just so you understand, in almost every Targaryen court, there was a master of ships from House Velaryon. The position of master of ships had practically become a hereditary position of House Velaryon. I'll summon our vassals and fleets. We can reach Dragonstone in a few hours. Orain spoke with a smile. He felt that this was the chance for him to be legitimized by the king, and with his brother's help, he could create a noble house vassal to House Velaryon. My queen. While enjoying the breeze on the balcony of her room, Daenerys heard the voice of one of the Serdakar ring out from behind the door. Yes, Merrick. Daenerys asked with narrowed eyes, feeling comfortable in the breeze. Her silver hair fluttered gently around her face. A fleet has been seen approaching Dragonstone. Merrick, surprised that Daenerys had remembered his name, spoke with a respectful tone. Any known coats of arms? Daenerys asked, curious. A silver seahorse on a sea-green background, Merrick replied. House Velaryon. A satisfied smile appeared on Daenerys' lips. For House Velaryon to have come to Dragonstone so quickly was a sign of how eager they were to be sworn back to House Targaryen. With the Velaryons on their side, at least 20 to 30% of the ships in House Baratheon's fleet would disappear in an instant. Daenerys began to dress herself. She had forgotten to bring Missandei from House Martell's ship. The girl had become a close friend of the Sand Snakes, as had she herself. Oberyn's bastard daughters were a funny bunch and easy to get along with. She wore a black outfit with a dragon of House Targaryen in red in the middle of the chest. The creature's wings formed a beautifully elaborate neckline, elegant without being vulgar. Montford Velaryon, accompanied by his half-brother, straightened his clothes and adopted a posture worthy of a descendant of ancient Valyria. After all, in terms of kinship, however distant, House Velaryon had provided 3 brides for Targaryen princes, including a king consort during the reign of Rhaenyra I Targaryen. Not to mention the countless marriages between the 2 houses before the conquest. Aegon the Conqueror's own mother was Valina Velaryon. As soon as the doors were opened, Montford heard the herald announce his arrival. Montford Velaryon, Lord of the Tides, Master of Driftmark and head of House Velaryon, along with his half-brother, Orain Waters. Orain was surprised to be announced, but quickly followed his brother. Montford entered the throne room, and when he came within 10 paces of the black stone throne, he stopped and bowed to the beautiful young woman sitting on it. It is an honor to be in your noble presence, my queen. Sitting on the throne is Queen Daenerys I Stormborn of House Targaryen, rider of Balerion, the unburned mother of dragons, maiden of healing, daughter of fire and light. Merrick introduced his queen in a cold and different voice, watching the guests from a distance. He and his brothers-in-arms protected Daenerys at all times. Lord Valerion, Lord Arain, welcome to Dragonstone. Daenerys crossed her legs elegantly, one over the other, and greeted them both with a curious look. The two men in front of her were handsome, like any descendant of Valyria, and carried themselves elegantly. Lord Montford's half-brother, however, looked rather malicious. But Daenerys knew that this malice was not directed at her. His smile itself conveyed that impression, which meant that he was a cunning man and probably thirsty for power. "Thank you for the warm welcome, Your Grace." Montford replied with a polite smile, marveling at Queen Daenerys' beauty. "I presume Your Grace the King is coming to Dragonstone?" he asked with a respectful tone. "My husband is in the north, about to begin our reconquest. He will not come until Dragonstone is besieged by the usurper fleet." Daenerys smiled as she replied, although she was slightly annoyed to feel that Montford was not paying her enough attention. "My queen was lucky. House Baratheon's fleet is in King's Landing right now, or Your Grace would have a hard time dealing with 200 Dromons." Montford spoke with a relieved tone. The thought of 200 Dromons facing the 20 ships of House Targaryen frightened him. He could imagine that King Enar would actually kill him if Queen Daenerys suffered any serious injuries or worse, died. "The Dromons would burn in dragon fire, Lord Montford. There would be no difficulty, it would just take longer to destroy them all." Daenerys commented with a dissatisfied tone upon hearing the insinuation that she would be in danger even riding a dragon. What could Montford say? He knew that this was the young queen's arrogance and her confidence in Balyrion's power, but he didn't share that same certainty. There were 200 Dromons, not just boats, but real warships. Still, he said nothing. It would be foolish to contradict a young and arrogant queen, especially one with a dragon. Regaining her composure, Daenerys asked, even though she already knew the answer, "I presume Lord Montford has come to kneel before me, his queen and my husband's representative." Montford and Arain didn't hesitate. They both knelt, but only Montford pronounced the oath. "I, Montford, head of House Valerion, Lord of the Tides and Master of Driftmark, swear to fight alongside House Targaryen against their enemies and to respect their laws as my own. I will protect the seas in the name of House Targaryen until the end of my days, as will my son and the sons after him. I accept your oath in the name of my husband, Lord Montford. I swear never to dishonor your name or that of your house. Your family will always have a place at my table until the end of my days, those of my children and the children after them." Sitting on the throne, Daenerys accepted Montford's oath with an interested look on her face. It was the first time she had received an oath, and she really liked the feeling. However, she wasn't so enthusiastic about Montford's oath. Enar had already told her that she and her whole family would live for a long time, so long that they could watch entire empires disappear while she would remain young, beautiful, and as full of life as a teenager, no matter how many thousands of years passed. Daenerys assumed that she would see all the lords of House Valerion disappear one by one, until one day House Valerion itself would cease to exist. After Montford's oath, other lords of Blackwater Bay came: House Celtigar, House Bar Emmon, and House Sunglass. They all swore allegiance to Daenerys and consequently to Enar, who was still in the north at the time. Now Daenerys was sitting in the head seat while food was served on the table, where the lords of Blackwater Bay ate and praised her beauty and elegance at every turn. For the first time, Daenerys understood why flatterers were so annoying. They were like flies trying to win her attention so that she would grant more benefits to the noble houses. Especially Lord Ardrian Celtigar, the old lord of Claw Island. In addition to an almost insatiable greed for gold, he was so arrogant that anyone would think that House Celtigar was a house of dragon lords. Honestly, Montford himself wasn't as presumptuous as Ardrian. Their first dinner on Dragonstone was a fiasco. Daenerys felt that the food was tasteless and the wine bitter. The presence of those men made the meal even more unpleasant. However, she kept a smile and ate without hesitation, while listening to the flattery of the Blackwater Bay lords. When dinner was finally over, Daenerys pretended to be tired and retired to Aegon's room, as it was called, since all the Targaryen kings and queens used this chamber when they spent time in the castle. "Damn Ardrian, I want you to die as soon as possible. My ears are tired of hearing so many compliments." Daenerys cursed the old lord of Claw Island. She had never seen anyone so disgusting, even when he spoke compliments. Falling into bed, the mother of dragons let out a comfortable sigh and buried her face in the clean, fresh-smelling sheets. She couldn't help wishing she was in Enar's arms at that moment. Remembering her husband, whom she hadn't seen for a year and a half, Daenerys snorted, expressing her dissatisfaction. Even though she knew he was busy, she thought he could at least have sent a raven or entered her dreams. But her husband had completely ignored her for a year and a half. In all honesty, Daenerys suspected that Enar had probably found a lover to spend time with in the north. At the thought of that possibility, she felt like killing the bitch who had seduced her husband, and then forgiving him for his betrayal. Daenerys knew she couldn't resist his charms and would give in after a few words of repentance and some sweet kisses. Humph. Snorting once more, she closed her eyes and fell asleep. If Enar had known Daenerys' thoughts, she would have protested vehemently. Because of the water of life and the warp dimension, he was adapting and constantly improving himself. In the process, he couldn't shield anyone from his mind, so he did absolutely nothing but train and grow stronger until he could finally communicate across great distances again. North, White Harbor, Your Grace. Wyman Manderley, Keeper of the White Knife, Shield of Faith, Defender of the Dispossessed, Lord Marshal of Mander and Knight of the Order of the Green Hand, greeted Enar with a respectful look as he watched the gigantic crimson dragon lie down at the back of Newcastle. Even though it wasn't the first time he had seen the creature, he still couldn't help but feel a sincere fear in the face of the gigantic beast, capable of reducing White Harbor to ashes in a few minutes. Lord Manderley, I see you're still in good health, and eating a lot. Enar greeted the Lord of White Harbor with a joke. Leda stood behind him, watching the fat old Lord of Newcastle, the castle of House Manderley. She couldn't believe that a man could walk as big as he was. She estimated that no horse could support his weight. Wyman touched his enormous belly with his fat fingers and let out a loud, powerful laugh. Perhaps I should have eaten fewer eels. These are my sons, Your Grace. Wylis and Wendell, both great knights. Next to Wylis is his wife, Leona. Wyman introduced his sons with a big, proud smile. Your Grace. Both brothers bowed with difficulty and greeted the king with respect. They looked at him with admiration. The first impression Enar gave them was of an incredibly tall man. Like their father, Wylis and Wendell were huge and fat. Curiously, the wife of Wylis, heir to White Harbor, Leona, was a rosy, plump woman with yellow hair. Her face was round, fleshy, and ruddy, although you could see that she had been a beautiful woman in her youth. These beautiful young ladies are my granddaughters, Winifred and Willa. Wyman introduced them with an even prouder smile than when he had introduced his sons. Your Grace. Winifred and Willa greeted Enar with curious looks. They were shocked by the king's height, feeling like children next to him. Note, damn George Martin for creating such similar names. Although it's normal in Nordic and English regions, I still want to cry when I remember how many similar names this guy wrote in his books. You have a fine family, Lord Manderley. Enar complimented the old Lord of White Harbor with a smile. He could tell that the whole family was close-knit and cherished the affection between them. I'll order them to serve a sumptuous lunch. I hope the king will be pleased with the hospitality of House Manderley. Wyman said, maintaining a cheerful, charismatic smile. Perhaps later, Lord Manderley. My fleet of 1,000 ships will arrive at White Harbor in a few hours. Although Enar had said that the fleet would arrive in a few hours, in fact, it would only arrive in half an hour. Wyman's face changed dramatically when he heard the number of ships. 1,000 ships was not a small number. Perhaps no port in the world could dock so many at the same time. What's more, the city couldn't support so many people. He assumed that there would be between 60 and 70,000 men. Don't worry, Lord Manderley. They're bringing supplies to camp outside the city and prepare for war. Enar certainly knew about Wyman's concerns. Any lord of a port city would be stressed by a fleet of this size. Wyman's face relaxed when he heard the king's words. It seemed that Enar had everything prepared and that he, as the host, wouldn't have to worry about many things, which pleased him. At the same time, he was shocked by the size of the king's fleet and army. This was no small number of men. In fact, It was second only to the Reach in quantity, surpassing the Western Lands and Storm's End. With the horses lent to them by House Manderley, Einar, Leda, Wyman, Wyllis and Wendell set off towards White Harbor's outer harbor. Once on the quay, Wyman looked at the horizon, but saw no sign of the fleet. Just as he was about to suggest that Einar sit down, he couldn't help holding his breath when he spotted small black dots on the horizon. There were countless of them, and as they approached White Harbor, he could see the immensity of the fleet. Thousands of ships were breaking the violent waves of the narrow sea. The black sails, bearing the crest of House Targaryen, filled his entire vision. Incredible. There was no other word to describe what he was feeling at that moment. Visenya watched the port city with a surprised look. Between the choppy waves, White Harbor seemed to emerge from the sea. The entire city was white and looked especially imposing from afar. White Harbor. Visenya murmured with a bright gaze. She wanted to see Einar as soon as possible. Being away from him for a year and a half had simply been agonizing. Only when he wasn't around did she realize how much she missed his presence. Even dinners were less lively without him. "Looks like we've arrived," Riella commented, balancing herself on the ship without stumbling. She had flown on a dragon countless times. Keeping her balance on a ship was nothing compared to this. Looking at her daughter, who seemed excited to be reunited with her nephew, Riella rolled her eyes. However, she understood well the pain of being away from the person you love. She couldn't help but think of the man she had loved when she was just a girl, at Daenerys' age. He was just the heir to a minor house, while she was a queen. In the end, she married Aerys, not the man she loved, on her parents' orders and out of duty, as was expected of a princess. Suddenly, the temperature around them rose, drawing the attention of Visenya and Riella. Both noticed the approach of the Reverend Mother, Kinvara. "I've already ordered the fleet to slow down." Kinvara spoke in a respectful tone, and as soon as she had finished, a trumpet sounded. Other trumpets soon followed, announcing the order to the entire House Targaryen fleet. "Thank you for your hard work." Riella thanked Kinvara with a kind look. The two had become great friends over the past 3 years. Kinvara shook her head and replied in a pitying tone, "It is only my duty as my lord's servant. I am merely a tool for his purposes." Riella rolled her eyes, but she understood why Kinvara and so many others considered Einar a god. His powers, the prescience and brainwashing, were enough to make the commoners worship him with sincerity and devotion. If she hadn't received a higher education, she might also have believed that Einar was a god. Suddenly, Kinvara looked up at the sky. In her eyes, the blue and red hues seemed to be fighting a constant battle in the sky. She knew it was the gods fighting, and the scene before her was a reflection of this confrontation still in progress. Great Other. Kinvara muttered the name of the enemy god of her faith with extreme antipathy. If there was a more disgusting entity in the world, it was the Great Other himself. A being who hated life and had wanted the destruction of the human race since the dawn of humanity. Fortunately, Lawler and the other gods prevented such a catastrophe from occurring, preserving the spark of humanity era after era, until the present day. Now, Azor Ahai had finally been reborn. Thinking of Einar, Kinvara couldn't have been happier. The Son of Light was everything she had hoped for, and more. He had turned the entire Red Faith into an indoctrination machine, making the religion gain more followers in a decade than it had in the last 1,000 years. How could that not be impressive? For her, Einar was her spiritual pillar, her living faith. With him by her side, she felt at peace to face the wrath of the barbarian gods without any fear. Observing her friend's increasingly fanatical gaze, Riella subtly pulled away, as if Kinvara were infected by a contagious disease, which in a way was true. After all, indoctrination and fanaticism really did act like a plague. Suddenly, as they approached the pier, Riella and Visenya couldn't help but notice the incredibly tall young man waiting for them. Although his stature was completely different, how could they not recognize Einar? "Welcome to the north, and to the start of our reconquest." They heard his voice clearly, despite the distance of dozens of meters. Walking down the wooden bridge that connected the ship to the pier, Visenya and Riella couldn't help but be shocked to see Einar up close. His height really surprised them, which wasn't unusual given that he had grown 25 centimeters in a year and a half. Husband. Visenya quickly snapped out of her state of surprise. She approached Inar and greeted him like a virtuous wife. Who would have thought that such a delicate, sweet face could excite on the battlefield like a true Valkyrie? Visenya, my dear queen. Inar held Visenya's face and gently kissed her forehead as he looked at the almost 20-year-old woman before him. She had only grown a few centimeters, which was not unusual. Only a few humans could grow as much as him in a short space of time. Honestly, if Inar hadn't controlled his growth rate, he would have been at least 40 centimeters taller than he was now, 2 meters and 10. Visenya couldn't help but show a happy expression at Inar's actions. Even if it was something simple, it was the small demonstrations of affection that really showed that he cared about her. You've grown up. After seeing that they had both greeted each other, Riella commented with a slightly shocked expression. Inar's height really was something of a surprise. However, when she saw Lida's height, she knew it was her grandson's doing, as Titus and Sigismund were of a similar height. One person of such height was surprising, 2 were rare, 3 unusual, and 4 already formed a pattern she couldn't ignore. Riella assumed that Inar was using blood magic to strengthen the people next to him, but obviously didn't ask about it in front of strangers, as it was a sensitive subject. Well, I'm still in the growing phase, dear grandmother. Inar commented with an amused tone, making Riella roll her eyes at her grandson's obvious lie. Queen Visenya, Queen Dowager Riella. Wyman greeted both queens with respect. His eyes turned to the sky, where 3 dragons could be seen flying over White Harbor. He couldn't help but be shocked to note that House Targaryen owned 5 dragons, all of which were of considerable size and could be ridden to take part in the war. He also couldn't help but thank Lord Stark for kneeling down without too much difficulty. The king's dragon alone was capable of destroying all the castles in the north. The north was as helpless as a virgin maiden in the face of such flying monsters. Lord Manderley, it's been many years since we've seen each other. Riella recognized Lord Manderley. She had seen him at the Harrenhal tournament as one of the most important vassals accompanying Lord Stark, who at the time was Ricard. However, the Lord of House Manderley was much fatter than he had been decades ago. The man had been fat for a long time, but he had become even bigger during the time she hadn't seen him. I'm honored that the Queen still remembers me. Although Wyman knew why he was remembered by Riella, he didn't care. Others might think him cowardly and weak, but only he knew that this was exactly the image everyone wanted him to convey. While Lord Manderley and Riella talked, Inar looked at Kinvara and nodded to his loyal subordinate. He could see that the woman was happy to meet him again after a year and a half. Just as he was about to greet her, Inar turned his face when he noticed a ship bearing the House Targaryen crest docked at the quay. A beautiful girl with black and white hair and olive skin could be seen coming down the wooden bridge and quickly arriving at his side. Inar. Rhaenys greeted him with a tight hug. She didn't care how tall he was and hugged him even tighter, as if to finally satisfy the longing she had felt after so long. Visenya watched the scene and narrowed her eyes. She may have been a little naive when it came to matters between men and women, but she wasn't stupid. It was clear that Rhaenys was looking at Inar in the same way that she and Daenerys looked at her husband. Rhaenys was equally interested in Inar. With the Princess of House Martell at Rhaenys' side, Visenya realized that factions were beginning to form in Inar's court. Remembering Daenerys' words about uniting against other women, Visenya agreed with her younger sister. Knowing of some of Inar's plans, Visenya was not against him having other wives, as long as it was her son or Daenerys who was his heir. With a sweet smile, Visenya approached Inar and took his arm, looking at him with a warm and gentle gaze. Inar, I'm starving. Introduce me to the food of the north. She spoke with an equally sweet and adorable tone, making it impossible for anyone to refuse her request. We'll talk later, Rhaenys. Inar stroked Rhaenys' hair and spoke in a gentle tone. As for Visenya and Rhaenys' little movements and thoughts, he couldn't have been more aware, but he didn't interfere. Where there were people, there was selfishness and interests. It was natural for factions to form in his court. As long as no one overstepped his boundaries, Inar could tolerate the palace fights between his wives. You could say that it was also a form of entertainment for everyone. Did you find something like that childish? It was indeed childish, but this childishness was necessary in order to gain more benefits. Rhaenys looked at Visenya with a slightly hostile gaze. Her aunt really wasn't joking when it came to vying for Enar's attention. Worst of all, she knew that Daenerys and Visenya had a great advantage because they were already his wives. However, remembering Arianne's words, Rhaenys was confident of winning this battle for Enar's attention. She had the advantage of knowing how to satisfy a man, something that Visenya and Daenerys certainly didn't know. Rhaenys couldn't help blushing as she remembered the bold words Arianne had said to her. As soon as Rhaenys got off the ship, the whole of House Martell accompanied her. Among them, Missandei searched every corner of the quay for Daenerys, but found no sign of her friend. This made her realize that Daenerys had made another impulsive decision, which, believe me, was not uncommon, especially after Balerion had grown big enough to be ridden. Your Grace. Oberyn looked up at the imposing Enar and greeted him with a surprised expression. He really hadn't expected the king to have grown so much in such a short time. However, when he saw how tall Enar and Visenya were, Oberyn's lips twitched in an unusual way. Although it was rude, he couldn't help wondering if Queen Visenya could handle Enar, given her small body. It was impossible not to think about it when seeing the enormous difference in size between husband and wife. I see you're well, my master of laws. Noticing the strange look on Oberyn's face, Enar rolled his eyes. Prince Martell's thoughts were so obvious that they seemed to be written all over his face. However, Enar knew that such thoughts would be common when faced with the size difference between him and his wives. Fortunately, he was already prepared to perform the blood ritual on Daenerys and Visenya. When he heard Enar call him Master of Laws, Oberyn's eyes lit up with a touch of satisfaction. Now he was part of Enar's court and would have more say in future decisions, which would not only improve his status in everyone's eyes, but also raise Dorne's standing. It would be an honor to serve, Your Grace. Oberyn replied with a respectful tone, bowing elegantly before the king. Enar nodded and rolled his eyes as he felt a burning gaze upon him. Glancing briefly to Oberyn's side, he saw Arianne watching him with a feline gaze. The woman didn't even bother to hide her intentions, expressing her desire vehemently. Enar, however, admired the desert princess's courage. He liked women who took the initiative. Sometimes conquering a woman was a tedious process, and if he could skip this step without any problems, he would gladly accept it. Suddenly, two incomparably tall and muscular young men and two old men in white armor got off one of the boats. Enar couldn't help but smile at the sight of his two primarchs and the royal guard Willem Darry, as well as Riella's guardian, Ser Barristan Selmy. Titus and Sigismund were really big, reaching 2 meters in height. Their muscles were strong and explosive. Even their heavy armor couldn't hide the power of their bodies. The 4 men knelt before Enar. They looked at their king with a reverent gaze, especially Titus and Sigismund, who practically seemed to be looking at a god. I hope the trip was to your liking. Enar gestured for the 4 of them to stand up and commented with a smile. We will always fight at the king's side, regardless of whether we have to cross mountains and seas. Sigismund spoke with a respectful tone while looking at Enar with a firm and determined gaze. Enar didn't doubt his words. The faith the brothers had in him was something akin to Leda's devotion. Order the ships to dock off the coast and camp in front of the city. Enar ordered, looking at the 4 men before him. He left these more mundane matters to the 4 of them. Yes, my king. The 4 spoke at the same time. New Castle, home of House Manderley. At the Triton court dinner table, in the great hall where House Manderley held its feasts and celebrations, the atmosphere was lively and slightly noisy. Observing his court gathered in the north, Enar had a satisfied look on his face. Sitting on the White Harbor throne, Enar chewed on a piece of sheep meat while declaring to everyone, "We'll stay a few days to let the Red Legion and the Serdaka rest. Then we'll leave without delay for Moat Cailin, where we'll meet the rest of the army. The food and weapons are ready to sustain a war for a year, as your grace ordered before leaving for Westeros." Oberyn informed, making Enar nod in satisfaction. Honestly, this amount of food and weapons was far from the total accumulated by the Red Faith over the last 8 years. However, with the long night approaching, Enar didn't want to waste food on a prolonged war. He intended to end this war in at least a year and at most 2. Even with dragons, conquest could not be rushed. He needed time to consolidate his rule in the 7 kingdoms. After all, conquering wasn't just about taking land. Dominating territories was easy, keeping them was difficult. Enar needed to ensure that the nobles who submitted to him didn't betray him as soon as he turned his back on them. It had taken Aegon the Conqueror years to stabilize his rule, and he had had to deal with countless rebellions. Compared to this, Enar felt that his conquest was relatively simple. Aegon I and Jaehaerys I had already solved many of the structural problems for him. Now it was a matter of restoring House Targaryen to the throne of Westeros. Of course, he would speed up the process by appointing some soldiers who had made conquest as the new nobility in Westeros, facilitating his rule over the 7 kingdoms. Husband, Daenerys has left for Dragonstone with 20 ships and the Sardaukar. Visenya commented with a helpless tone, acting as if she was defenseless in the face of her younger sister's reckless choices. Riella gave her eldest daughter a disgruntled look and snorted coldly. She was unhappy that Visenya had put all the blame on Daenerys, when Visenya herself had supported Daenerys. Enar rolled his eyes when he heard this. He realized that his queen had become more cunning in the time they had been apart. Using his prescience, he clearly saw the moment when Visenya sided with Daenerys in the argument with Riella. Don't worry about her. She's already conquered Dragonstone and made almost every lord in Blackwater Bay bend the knee to her on my behalf. Enar said in a casual tone, but anyone could sense the pride in his voice. He was obviously pleased that Daenerys had conquered and helped conquer House Targaryen. The king's words made everyone look at him in surprise. No one expected Daenerys to conquer Dragonstone so quickly. After all, this was the fortress of Stannis Baratheon, King Robert's brother and one of the main nobles in charge of the royal fleet of House Baratheon. The island was, in practice, a naval fortress full of warships. How Daenerys had taken Dragonstone with only 20 ships and a dragon was a question on Oberyn's mind and that of everyone present. The Baratheon fleet is in King's Landing, ready to set sail for Lannisport, where it will join the House Lannister fleet in besieging High Garden. There were few defenders in Dragonstone, and the nobles of Blackwater Bay stayed behind, fearing that Fleet Redwine would attack King's Landing. Sensing the confusion in the eyes around him, Enar answered everyone's questions naturally. Enar's words caused everyone to display satisfied expressions. Taking Dragonstone and securing the loyalty of the noble houses of Blackwater Bay meant that they had free passage to besiege King's Landing whenever they wanted. In addition, they had managed to steal a considerable part of House Baratheon's fleet. When war breaks out in the next few days, I'll go to the Vale and make the Lord submit. House Arryn will bend the knee. Enar declared, his voice firm and commanding. Meanwhile, Rhaenys and Visenya will leave for the Riverlands to accept the oaths of the lords of the region and guarantee our authority, while awaiting my return from the Vale. He gave Visenya and Rhaenys a serious look, making it clear that he would use the dragon riders of House Targaryen in full force. You too have my permission to burn and destroy any noble house that refuses to bow. His voice took on a cold, authoritative tone. Furthermore, I authorize you to appoint new lords and grant land to soldiers who demonstrate valor. Those words made Visenya and Rhaenys' eyes sparkle with satisfaction. Neither of them had expected to take part in the war so soon, let alone receive so much power. Enar had practically handed the Riverlands over to them to conquer. However, before any of them could express their elation, he added with a sharp look, "But you must not move against Riverrun. House Tully is mine to destroy." Enar turned to Riella, his voice laden with authority. "I want Harrenhal as a fortress to contain threats from the western lands. I will entrust that task to my grandmother." He paused briefly before adding, "Queen Riella will have the same powers as Visenya and Rhaenys." In conventional armies, fighting on so many fronts could be a strategic mistake, weakening the forces by dispersing them. However, with dragons, few problems couldn't be solved with dragon fire. Riella was surprised by the appointment. She genuinely hadn't expected to be mobilized for war, but a sense of satisfaction quickly overcame her. The fate of House Targaryen was being played out on the battlefield, and she would not stand idly by while her family fought to regain its throne. "Who will be Lord Paramount of the Riverlands, husband?" asked Visenya, intrigued. Knowing that House Tully would be destroyed, she wanted to know who would take their place. After all, the Riverlands couldn't be without rulers. It wasn't just her curiosity. Oberyn and Riella also turned their gazes to Enar, attentive. After all, this was no ordinary fiefdom, but one of the 7 kingdoms. Enar, however, answered naturally, without caring about the impact of his words. "House Targaryen will rule the Riverlands." Oberyn and Wyman's eyes widened in surprise. Enar's decision broke a centuries-old tradition. One of the reasons Aegon I had managed to subjugate the 7 kingdoms with relative ease was that he had allowed the kingdoms to continue with regional laws and customs. But Enar saw this as a mistake. The truth was that, even after centuries of Targaryen rule, the 7 kingdoms were still 7 kingdoms, not a single united kingdom. For Enar, this system of power was similar to that of the Holy Roman Empire, where an emperor was elected by the kingdoms, but each still maintained its own autonomy, laws, and customs. The only difference was that House Targaryen could not be replaced by vote. Even so, in practice, Westeros was more like a confederation of interests than a truly unified nation. Such a thing could not be considered serious in the eyes of House Targaryen, which still had dragons. But after House Targaryen lost the dragons, they had nowhere near half the power they had when they had dragons. Without dragons, the weapon to destroy any rebellion, the 7 kingdoms became a hidden danger that all the Targaryen kings feared would one day explode at once. Which proved to be true with the rebellion 14 years ago. Do you think that if Aerys II Targaryen had a dragon the size of Caraxes, the rebellion would have happened? Most likely, Aerys would have suffered the same fate as Maegor the Cruel. Oberyn opened his mouth to reply, trying to persuade the king to reconsider his decision. However, as soon as Enar's cold eyes fell on him, the red serpent closed his mouth immediately. The silence that followed was heavy. "Prince Oberyn," Enar's voice was soft but laden with veiled menace, "I don't like to be contradicted." He brought the wine glass to his lips, without looking away from Prince Martell's expression. "If you are dissatisfied with my decisions, the door is open. You can return to the comfort of the old palace at Sunspear whenever you wish." There was a calm, indifferent tone to his words, as if losing a talented general like Oberyn was irrelevant. If necessary, he could simply train Titus and Sigismund to take his place. Oberyn held the king's gaze for a brief moment before lowering his head, a controlled smile playing on his lips. "I apologize, Your Grace." He bowed elegantly, his voice as smooth as silk. "I misspoke." Enar kept her gaze on him for a few more seconds, assessing. Then he nodded, smiling again as if nothing had happened. At night, in the bedroom, Visenya could be seen completely naked on Enar's chest. Her long silver hair fell over her body as she kissed him gently, covering his chest with soft, lingering kisses. Sweat beaded on both of their bodies as they stared at each other in comfortable silence. "I've missed you." Visenya kissed his chest once more and spoke in a sweet tone. Her lilac eyes stared deeply into his purple ones. Stroking her hair tenderly, Enar commented in an apologetic tone. "I'm sorry, Visenya. My mind was going through a transformation. If I connected our minds, you'd probably go mad." If there was one thing Enar never underestimated, it was the madness that was his mind. The weight of the past, present and future made his mind a crazy mess of chaotic thoughts. Brynden could bear it, but another person with no training in magic would go mad connecting with his mind. Visenya looked at Enar with concern when she heard his words. She rose gently, climbing on top of him. Straightening her posture, she sat on his waist, her naked body exposed before her husband, without a trace of modesty. "I want to help you, Enar." Visenya spoke with a worried tone. "I don't want you to go mad." Looking at the naked body before him, Enar smiled and wrapped his arms around Visenya's small figure, bringing her into the comfort of his chest. Kissing the back of her neck tenderly, He felt his body shudder with the kiss, and it made him smile. As he continued to kiss her sweaty skin, Einar spoke between kisses. "You already help me, my queen. You are my sun in an immeasurable darkness, guiding me to sanity." Visenya couldn't help but breathe quickly as she felt the kisses on her nape, neck and shoulder, each touch of his warm lips seeming to electrify her body, causing her to let out small, lovely, sensual moans. "You are also my sun and stars, my husband and the greatest man of all." Gripping his white gold hair tightly, Visenya whispered in his ear as her sensitive body squirmed softly at the touch of Einar's lips and his unscrupulous hands. "Do you want to continue?" Einar asked with an amused tone. Although it seemed that they felt the pleasure of the flesh, they didn't. They just enjoyed each other's bodies without breaking the last barrier. "No." Visenya refused without any hesitation. There was a teasing smile on her lips. "Has anyone ever told you that you're cruel?" Einar commented helplessly when he saw the smile on his wife's lips. Only he knew how much effort he was making to hold back. Any other man would have devastated Visenya long before now. However, since she didn't want to, Einar wasn't going to force anything. He wasn't a monster to do something like that against a woman's will. "Don't blame me for sleeping with Ariane," Einar said with the same teasing tone as Visenya. "Have you noticed?" Visenya asked curiously as she kissed Einar's broad shoulder. She didn't know if she could love Einar even more, but she found that there was still room for her love to grow. Her man was too incredible. However, it wasn't as if she didn't want to give herself completely to Einar, but she knew that something was easily unappreciated. "She practically looked at me with flames in her eyes." Einar rolled her eyes and commented amusedly. "So you know about Rhaenys?" Visenya continued to ask with a curious look. "Yes, it's fun to see her trying to attract attention." Einar's lips curved into a smile as he remembered Rhaenys. Pretending not to notice her advances is just too much fun. The frustration on her face is something I really enjoy doing. Visenya was speechless listening to Einar's words. She felt a little sorry for Rhaenys. The woman was doing everything to win his attention, but she didn't know she was serving as entertainment for him. "Don't you think it's cruel?" Visenya asked with a smile as she looked at him. "Isn't it normal for every younger brother to tease his older sister?" Einar turned the question back to Visenya, leaving her speechless again. Visenya smiled and brushed it aside. As Rhaenys was her rival, the longer this went on, the more advantage she and Daenerys would gain. Lying comfortably on his chest, Visenya commented in a soft tone, "I want to marry in Harrenhal." "You don't want to marry in the Great September of Baelor?" Einar asked confusedly. "Daenerys wants to get married in King's Landing. I want to get married in Harrenhal." Visenya replied without a second thought. "It's a good proposal, especially as it will bring everyone closer together when the wedding takes place." Einar commented with a glare. "As we all know, humans are usually happy at big celebrations. They forget their worries and simply have fun with each other. You want to use our wedding for political interests." Nudging Einar's cheek with her finger, Visenya commented with a smile. However, looking at her, there was no sense of dissatisfaction in her gaze. "It's our duty as king and queen." Einar replied with a smile as she hugged Visenya slightly tighter, causing Visenya to let out a sweet, pleasant laugh. "King and queen," Visenya murmured with a lost look on her face. "Is there a problem, my beautiful queen?" Noticing this, Einar asked with a soft tone. "It's just that I never thought we'd be like we are today." The whole family was focused on a single goal, the survival of humanity. Visenya replied, closing her eyes and enjoying the caresses in her hair. "Yes, fate really is unpredictable." Einar commented with a complicated tone. "Not for you, husband." Visenya, still with her eyes closed, spoke. "I'm not that powerful, at least not at the moment." Einar replied in a calm tone. They were both silent after these words, but the silence was broken by Visenya. Suddenly remembering something, Visenya opened her eyes and asked with a curious tone, "By the way, How did Leda, Titus, and Sigismund grow so tall? There was no way of noticing the similar heights between the three. It was obvious that something was going on. Einar didn't hesitate to answer everything he knew, including what he planned for the whole family. So we're going to get bigger, more powerful, able to develop skills like manipulating some element, and also able to live for a long time? Visenya asked with an incredulous tone. Yes. Einar replied with an amused tone. He really liked to shock people with his words. When are we going to do this? Visenya asked with a bright look, her voice tinged with excitement. In her eyes, House Targaryen will practically become gods with such rituals. Soon, I just have to adjust a few things in the blood ritual for our family. Einar replied with a smile. Seeing Visenya so excited to become stronger was comforting to him. At the same time, the blood rite for House Targaryen and the blood rite for the Primarchs were two different things. House Targaryen would have the more advanced and powerful version, while the Primarchs would have the weaker version. The reason for this was simple. Humans could be used by chaos, and even if they had good intentions, those intentions would be manipulated. Therefore, in order to prevent the Primarchs from becoming too strong and rebelling if they fell to the Chaos Gods, Einar had to limit their strength. That's not to say that they would be weak. They would be equally powerful demigods. But they would be weaker than the divine dynasty he was creating. Visenya nodded, but the excitement on her face was hard to hide. Who wouldn't want to have the advantages that Einar spoke of? They practically became gods to the people and would rule for all eternity. Honestly, now I feel a bit stupid for caring about the heir to the kingdom. Visenya commented, settling back comfortably on Einar's chest, using him as a pillow. If they were to be immortal, having an heir was irrelevant. Einar would live forever, just like them, so the idea of choosing an heir seemed irrelevant. That's not true. I can spend a few centuries on vacation enjoying life with my beautiful wives, and for that, I need an heir. Einar said with an amused and playful tone, making Visenya laugh. Forgive me for not thinking about your vacation, dear husband. Visenya said with a laugh as she hugged Einar tighter. 3 days later, a war march advanced towards the south of Westeros, made up of a legion of men wearing red armor and men in golden masks. Mounted on a horse, Einar and his court could be seen surrounded by the Sardaukar. Unlike the 50,000 men of the Red Legion, the Sardaukar were fewer in number, around 20,000 men, all wearing golden masks and white and gold cloaks. This certainly made a strong impression on the 4,000 soldiers of House Manderley. Many didn't dare approach the men in the golden masks. Your Grace, in order to reach the Vale and the Riverlands, we have to pass through the Twins, at the Green Fork on the Trident. Oberyn spoke in a cold tone, mentioning the castle called the Twins. An expression that Wylis, heir to White Harbor, shared. If there was a noble house more notorious than the Boltons themselves, it was House Frey. All kinds of bad and malicious names could be attributed to House Frey and its lord, Walder Frey. Einar nodded. Of course he knew about House Frey. There was no ignoring the noble house that had dared to kill Robb on his wedding day. Even if it was in another reality, House Frey was no different, and the Lord of the Crossing was an unscrupulous man whom Einar planned to destroy with his own hands. Will the Lord of House Frey dare block our march south? We have dragons. Visenya asked in a curious tone. Although she didn't know anything about House Frey, from Oberyn and Wylis' disgusted expressions, she knew that it was a house with a very bad reputation. He'll probably want us to pay for the passage, Oberyn replied to the future queen of Einar, with a respectful tone. He would dare charge us. Visenya exclaimed in disbelief. They had over 70,000 soldiers and 4 dragons. This was an army that not even Harren the Black had had the privilege of facing hundreds of years ago. She couldn't imagine that anyone would be foolish enough to demand payment for their passage. Don't underestimate people's greed, my queen. Gold and silver are often more tempting than life itself, Oberyn said with a serious tone. Although he didn't think Walder would charge the army for passage either, given how cautious he was, he wouldn't be surprised if the Lord of the Crossing demanded something. When we reach the Twins, we'll attack the castle, Einar declared at that moment, causing everyone to look at him in surprise. They hadn't really expected Einar to attack directly, without even giving House Frey a chance to survive. Walder Frey will invite us to dinner and poison us. His sons will finish the job by killing us with arrows." Enar spoke calmly, as if it were no big deal, but the expressions of the entire House Targaryen changed dramatically. Riella, Visenya, and Rhaenys knew that Enar could see the future and trusted him completely. So when they found out what would happen to them, they all displayed cold expressions. If they had previously been neutral towards Walder Frey, they now harbored strong negative emotions towards the Lord of the Crossing. Although not everyone was aware of Enar's abilities, like House Martell and House Manderly, the rest of the people who were connected to the Red Faith, like Kinvara, knew his capabilities very well. Oberyn and all of House Martell looked at Enar with strange expressions. The king spoke almost as if he knew exactly what was going to happen, which was completely impossible in their eyes. After all, seeing into the future was not a power a man could have, no matter how special he was. So Enar's words sounded more like an assumption based on the description he had heard from Oberyn. "No matter how ambitious Walder is, he won't dare violate guest law, Your Grace. He would make an enemy of practically all the noble houses, including his own vassals, who would not dare trust their backs to such an untrustworthy lord." Oberyn spoke with a serious tone. The right of the guest was something practically sacred, which few had dared to break over the millennia. And those who did suffered terrible fates. "You forget that fear can do wonders for one's reputation. If he kills us, how much prestige do you think he'll gain? Who would dare attack someone who eliminated the Targaryen, who possessed dragons?" Enar said, looking at Oberyn with a smile on his face. Walder could guarantee hundreds of years of peace and a lot of money. How could he refuse Tywin's offer? Enar said with a cold tone. Yes, Tywin Lannister had already made contact with Walder Frey. The Lord of the Rock had promised the Lord of the Crossing money and power, including more land. Tywin Lannister? Hearing the name of the murderer of his sister and nephew, Oberyn's eyes sharpened. Yes. My spies have discovered that Walder Frey and Tywin Lannister have exchanged letters several times. Enar nodded. If Walder Frey and Tywin Lannister are allied, then your Grace's hunch may indeed come true, said Oberyn. Upon hearing Enar's confirmation, his eyes turned cold and murderous, resembling the gaze of a serpent. Perhaps that was the origin of his nickname among the people. Your Grace, called Tyrion, who had been silent until that moment. Yes, my Lord Hand. Enar looked at Tyrion and asked with a smile. Since we know my father is involved, send the news to every noble house in Westeros. Let everyone know how vile he is. Break his reputation and make the vassals of House Lannister fear that Tywin will do something similar to them. Tyrion spoke in a cold tone. He couldn't help but smile at the thought of the blow he would be dealing to his father's prestige. Believe him, one of the reasons the rules exist is to prevent exactly what Enar mentioned. Without rules, anyone can die at any time, and no noble wants to die. That's why everyone respects the right of guests, because they fear that one day they could be in the place of those who have been betrayed. Tyrion's proposal brought a smile to Enar's lips. As he had said, this really was an excellent move against Tywin. When the man goes to seek alliances, who will trust him? Only a fool would trust a man capable of ordering the death of guests protected under guest law. Tywin probably never imagined that letters that only he and Walder would know could be discovered by someone. Unfortunately, he never even imagined that Enar could see the past, present, and future. Had he known, he might never have left King's Landing and would have concentrated all his forces on staying on the defensive instead of attacking. Do it. Enar gave Tyrion permission and added, sign it with your name and current position. Enar took the opportunity to tell Westeros that he was someone who knew how to forgive, and accepted Tyrion Lannister as Hand of the King. This would deal a double blow to Tywin and Robert, which would make it harder for everyone to recruit more people. Enar just had to stay in Harrenhal and wait for the lords of the noble house to come to him and kneel before him. Yes, your grace. As an intelligent man, Tyrion knew what Enar wanted to do by asking him to sign the letters. I'll help you, Tyrion. Oberyn smiled and offered to help. Curiously, Oberyn and Tyrion became friends after a year and a half of living together, their hatred of Tywin having made their relationship much easier. They became close friends and frequented all the brothels in Volantis. Seeing both of them walking away, Enar smiled and continued marching towards Moat Cailin, where his uncle was at that moment, waiting for him to arrive and march together to Twins. "Enar, I see Moat Cailin," Rhaenys commented, looking up at the gigantic castle made of black stone rising solitarily into the sky and gradually appearing on the horizon. Of the original 20 towers of the castle, there were only 7 still standing today. Originally there were only 3, but another 4 were rebuilt in the renovation of the castle that will be the fiefdom of Rickon Stark, son of the Lord of Winterfell. The walls of Moat Cailin were the same size as the walls of Winterfell. The castle defended the north from the south for 10,000 years and still looked majestic. That was Moat Cailin. Enar smiled over Moat Cailin. Now they just had to wait a bit and march towards Twins, starting the attacks in the Vale and Riverlands. The reconquest had begun. Eddard looked at the long war march and couldn't help but display a stunned expression. He had heard from Enar that his soldiers would be arriving from Essos, but at the sight of the red and gold wave occupying his vision, the Lord of Winterfell couldn't help but widen his eyes. The number of men before him was not small. On the contrary, it was larger than his own army, which numbered around 35 to 40,000 soldiers. "I hope Enar brought supplies for such a large number of men," muttered Eddard. He raised his head and saw 4 dragons flying around the army. After taking one last look at the troops, he descended from the wall of Moat Cailin, ready to greet his nephew and all of House Targaryen. At the gates, Eddard was accompanied by all his vassals as he watched the army of gold-masked soldiers approaching with steady steps. As he looked closer, he realized that it was an extraordinary army. He could see and hear that the soldiers' steps were in perfect sync, as if they were a single entity. This showed admirable discipline, something that the soldiers of the north could never match. Then Eddard spotted the members of House Targaryen. The Lord of Winterfell let out a sigh as he saw them approaching. If there was one thing he truly regretted, it was the fact that his actions had caused so much suffering to innocent people who had nothing to do with the Mad King's sins. "Your Grace." Eddard greeted Enar first, and then his eyes fell on the older woman with the long silver hair and lilac eyes. He took on a regretful expression and spoke in a softer tone, "Queen Dowager Riella." Riella watched the mature man before her and couldn't help noticing how much Eddard Stark had changed since Harrenhal. The shy boy, unable to converse with a lady, had completely transformed into a man. "I see you've learned how to talk to a woman without stuttering, Lord Stark," she commented in an amused tone, joking with one of the people most responsible for the fall of House Targaryen. Eddard's eyes widened when he heard Riella's joke. "Ha ha ha ha." The lords of the north burst into laughter at the queen's words. They looked at their liege lord and couldn't help but laugh even louder. "Lord Stark, as a young man, really stuttered in front of a beautiful woman," commented Greatjon, letting out a loud and powerful laugh. "In the old days, Lord Stark looked like a wolf cub who didn't know how to bite yet," added Meej in an amused tone. Eddard, seeing his vassals laughing at him, was speechless, but cast a complex glance at Riella. The woman showed no animosity towards him, and that only made him feel even more ashamed. He looked like a hypocrite, while Riella looked like someone of honor. Honestly, he would have preferred to be shouted at in anger, even slapped in the face, but when he saw the serene, peaceful look on her face, he knew that wouldn't happen. Under everyone's surprised gaze, Eddard knelt down in front of the horse Riella was riding. "I know that my words can never bring the dead back to life, but I still want to apologize. My actions have led both you and me to lose important people. Every time I remember the events of 14 years ago, I feel unworthy to look you in the eye." He spoke with a tone full of regret and pain. The cheerful atmosphere was shattered by Eddard's words. Everyone looked at him, shocked. Riella displayed a complex expression and in an instant, got off her horse. Looking at the man kneeling before her, the Dowager Queen spoke with a weary tone. "He killed your father and brother. You had every right to fight for revenge. I don't blame you for rebelling against my husband and brother. Aerys was mad, a hostage to fear and a grandiosity he never had. Stand up, Lord Stark. We've all lost almost all of our family. We don't need to put the blame on each other. Perhaps in another circumstance, we could have been a family, with Lyanna being queen of the Seven Kingdoms and Enar growing up as a true prince in the Red Keep. but fate didn't want it that way. Then don't blame yourself. I'd do the same thing myself if I were in your shoes. Riella helped Eddard to his feet and spoke with a sincere tone. She had 14 years to sink into hatred, but she hadn't. She knew that everything was the fault of Ares and the other conspirators. The more Riella showed understanding, the more Eddard felt ashamed, not daring to look the queen in the eye. However, without anyone knowing, he had made an important decision. When the war was over, he would relinquish his titles and pass on the lordship of Winterfell to Robb. Then he would join the Night's Watch and serve the Order until they no longer needed him. Enar, who had heard everything up to that point, cast a calm glance at Eddard and let out a helpless sigh. Sometimes he wished he didn't know what would happen in the future. Still, if that man was at peace with his choice, Enar would accept it. "Let's go in, we have a war to plan." Enar spoke, making the atmosphere slightly more relaxed. Everyone bowed to him and replied, "Yes, Your Grace." Eddard looked at his nephew and realized that Enar knew of his decision, which didn't surprise him. Not for the first time, he suspected that he could see into the future. Remembering the dragon dreams, a gift of House Targaryen, he knew that Enar could indeed have glimpses of what was to come. However, seeing his nephew's look of approval, Eddard understood that Enar respected his choice and would accept his joining the Night's Watch. At Enar's words, everyone entered Moat Cailin and the real pre-war meeting began. In the Great Hall of Moat Cailin, which had been rebuilt, a carved wooden table displayed a map of the Seven Kingdoms. Enar was standing next to it, staring intently at the map in front of him. He pointed directly at the twins, who would be his next target. "Our first target is the twins. We're going to destroy the castle and kill all the Fry." As soon as Enar uttered these words, the Northern Lords who were not yet aware of the situation were shocked. "Before you say anything, know that Walder Frey is conspiring with Tywin Lannister to kill us as soon as we enter his castle as guests." Enar spoke with a calm, cold tone, anticipating the questions. "Damn Walder Frey. Damn Tywin Lannister." Great John slammed his fist against the table and shouted, his gaze filled with fury. The right of the guest was a sacred law, so strong that even if the most hated of wildlings was staying in a northern castle, no one would dare raise a voice against him. The expressions of the others present were no better than Greatjon's. Knowing that they could be killed under the protection of the right of the guest was terrifying. It was as if there were no laws left to maintain order in Westeros. "For that reason, we're going to destroy the twins and House Frey. This trash can no longer exist," Enar declared coolly, causing many to look at him with admiration, especially the Northerners, who saw his decision as a sign of strength and courage. After all, it wasn't every day that someone dared to destroy one of the most powerful castles in Westeros. "What do you intend to do, Your Grace? Burn down the entire castle with your dragon?" Eddard asked in a calm tone. But behind his apparent calm, there was a silent fury about to explode. Like his liege lord House Tully, he knew that the Freys were not worthy of trust or respect. "No. Let's test my new siege weapons. They are capable of attacking castles and causing great damage to their structures." Enar's words took everyone by surprise. Eyes widened and expressions of shock filled the hall. A weapon capable of causing major damage to the structures of a castle? How could they not be surprised? Enar knew that trebuchets existed in that world, but for him, these siege weapons were inefficient. So he created something much simpler with the knowledge he had in his mind. He brought into existence the greatest invention of the human race in ballistic terms: gunpowder. Tyrion looked at all the lords and ladies of the north and realized that they were present. He noticed the look of confusion on their faces when they saw the weapon called bombard. This, however, did not surprise him. The metal weapon itself wasn't large and didn't look particularly threatening, just an ordinary bronze cylinder. If Tyrion hadn't personally seen the power of these weapons, he would probably have had the same expression of disbelief. But after witnessing its destructive force, he realized that the world was much vaster than he had imagined. Who would have thought that an apparently simple and unimpressive weapon could contain such overwhelming destructive power? Enar watched the Sardaukar loading the cannonballs. The 3 soldiers of his private army stared at him, awaiting his orders. With a simple nod, Enar gave permission for the attack. Boom! 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 In an instant, Tyrion heard a huge explosion. His ears were filled with a deafening ringing before 3 more detonations reverberated across the field. The northern lords opened their mouths in shock at the sight of the craters in the ground. Never in their lives had they witnessed a simple metal ball cause such destruction. But the proof was right in front of them, and they couldn't deny it. That power terrified them. They imagined that weapon being fired at the walls of their castles, and they felt fear. Estimating the resistance of their fortifications against this new weaponry was frightening. Castles with great walls could withstand such an impact for perhaps a month, or just a few weeks. And this conclusion shook them to the core. Castles were known for their endurance and for withstanding sieges for months, and in cases of abundant supplies, for up to 5 years. Great John, Lord of the Last Hearth, felt this fear even more intensely. House Umber's castle was made of wood, and in the face of a weapon like that, it wouldn't last a month. Perhaps not even a day. Looking at the faces of those present, an almost imperceptible smile appeared on Enar's lips. He wanted to demonstrate this power to the lords who were still reluctant to follow his orders. However, what they didn't know was that the bombard's rate of fire was absurdly slow for someone who came from a world where a single gun could fire hundreds of projectiles per second. Another limiting factor was the material from which the cannons were made. Being made of bronze, the barrel would quickly overheat and could explode, destroying the gun itself. Even so, Enar was pleased to have been able to develop this technology in just a few years. The blacksmiths of Volantis worked hard to build the bombard. The first one took about 7 months to complete, and it took several more months before it was ready to be used as it was now. Another point he had to mention was that such weapons would never be given to the lords of Westeros. Only House Targaryen could possess such weapons, at least for the moment. Only after 2 generations of cannons would Enar start selling the first-generation cannons. House Targaryen should always be 2 to 3 generations ahead of the weapons circulating on the market, at least until the Great Crusade, which he would undertake to unify the world, was successfully completed. When the special exploration began, he would release the entire technological tree to the noble houses and other organizations. By then, the rule of each Targaryen house would be deeply ingrained in the people, including the worship of the God Emperor of mankind. However, that was for the future. Enar needed to start the war for that to happen. As you can see, we're going to use the bombards to besiege twins and eventually weaken the morale of House Frey's army. Enar spoke with a calm and confident tone, as if it were something normal. But this calmness and confidence caused all the vassals around him to show equally confident expressions, boosting the morale of the entire army. Curiously, like House Tyrell, House Tully was incompetent when it came to controlling its vassals. House Frey, as well as being a powerful Riverlands house, was one of the most powerful, with a large army of 15,000 men. The Riverlands had around 45 to 50,000 men in total, with House Frey's soldiers accounting for around 30% of that number, which clearly showed House Tully's incompetence in governing its vassals and accumulating wealth over almost 300 years. House Tyrell, although weak in terms of military strength, was incredibly wealthy, even making loans to the crown several times. However, House Tully, as well as being weak militarily, was poor, as was House Arryn, which was strong militarily. Honestly, apart from House Lannister, House Martell and House Tyrell, the other great houses of Westeros were pitifully poor. After the incredible display of power, all the lords returned to Moat Cailin and continued their pre-war meeting. Looking at everyone, Enar continued, although House Frey's army of 15,000 men is no problem in the face of our forces of over 100,000 men, we don't want to cause unnecessary deaths. We have another enemy besides House Baratheon to fight. When Enar spoke those words, the faces of the lords of the north changed dramatically. The only one who was calm was Mance Rayder. The image of the whites sent chills through the bodies of all the lords and ladies of the north. If they could, they wanted to forget that they had seen that undead monster, but it was impossible. They knew they would have to fight those things in the future. Riella, Visenya and Rhaenys looked curiously at the Lord of the North's expressions. It was the first time they had seen such an expression of fear on the faces of these men and women full of ferocity. It wasn't just them who were curious. The whole of House Martell and Tyrion also showed curious expressions. Although their curiosity had different purposes, the three women knew about the Night King and the White Walkers, but the rest of the court had been kept in the dark until then. Einar, seeing this, realized that he had forgotten to introduce the White Wanderers. "Leda, go get the cage and bring it out for everyone to see," Einar ordered his loyal sword with an amused tone. Leda looked at Einar wordlessly, knowing that the king wanted to shock people more. She left and returned 10 minutes later. She returned dragging a cage that was the size of a grown man and the width of 2 men. However, what was imprisoned was what caused the shock in the eyes of Oberyn, Tyrion, and all of House Martell. Grua. A bestial roar escaped the White's blue lips, causing Oberyn's mistress, Illyria Sand, to recoil with an expression of fear. "That's a White. As you can see, he's dead, but he can still move." Einar approached the metal cage and commented casually. He punched the creature, causing it to fall to the floor of the cage, but the monster still got up and tried to attack Einar wildly. They don't need to eat or rest, meaning they can march forever, including walking underwater. Einar continued speaking. At this very moment, there are around 200,000 of these things marching towards the wall. Einar's words caused many to show expressions of fear, including the Northern Lords who had already seen the White. The number was truly huge. Besides, Whites can't die normally. So even if I cut off his head, he can still walk around as if nothing had happened. Einar spoke and showed everyone that his words were true. Einar cut off the White's head, and everyone saw that, even with the head cut off, the monster's body and head were still moving. How are we going to fight something like that? Tyrion asked with an incomparably serious expression. From Einar's description, it seemed that the Whites were an invincible army that could not be defeated. Nothing is without weakness, including these things. Einar answered Tyrion's question with a calm expression. For normal Whites, fire can kill them. But the Whites are not the problem. Who creates the Whites is the crux of the problem. Einar looked seriously at everyone. The White Walkers can create Whites infinitely. In other words, when we're fighting the Whites, anyone who dies will be transformed into that kind of monster and will kill you without any hesitation. An incredibly heavy atmosphere hung in the air. Einar's words were still clear in their minds. This kind of ability was terrible for humans, who had volatile emotions and cared about their companions. Not only that, the White Walkers, as well as being able to control the dead, can use ice magic to create weapons and shields as they please. They're as strong as 10 grown men and as fast as a mountain lion. Einar spoke calmly. Can we win against such monsters? The one who asked the question was Rhaenys, who was silent, staring at the White trapped in the cage. Her fear gradually calmed down. Yes. Einar spoke without any hesitation. We're going to win. Einar's words rekindled everyone's morale, especially when they saw his calm, confident face. It seemed that nothing could shake the man in front of them, and that made everyone calm down in the face of the impending war. I know many are worried, but the White Walkers are not without weaknesses. Dragon fire, dragon glass, obsidian, and Valyrian steel can kill them easily. Einar spoke in a calm, deep tone, his purple eyes scanning everyone in the great hall of Moat Cailin. Fortunately, my queen has conquered Dragonstone, where there is a mineral vein of dragonglass. We can start mining as soon as this war is over. Einar added with a satisfied smile, remembering Daenerys' actions. The girl's bold move had saved him a lot of time. The expressions of many eased at the knowledge that they had the means to kill the White Walkers. Valyrian steel was rare, and dragonfire even more so, since dragons had only recently come back to life after centuries of disappearance. That's good, Your Grace. I will immediately send a raven to Dragonstone, asking Queen Daenerys to start the mining process as soon as possible. Even if she doesn't have many miners available for the job, any amount of dragonglass will help enormously in the coming war. Tyrion spoke with an incredibly serious tone. Now that he knew the war wasn't just about the throne, but about the survival of humanity, he was even more determined to end it as soon as possible. Einar nodded, agreeing with his hand's proposal, and continued, after extinguishing House Frey, the army will be divided into 2 fronts. The The valley and the riverlands will be the first objectives to be conquered. We will attack both at the same time. I'll follow the army to the valley mounted on caraxes. My wives and my grandmother will fly with the army that will march to the riverlands, to make the lords there bend the knee. The command of the troops marching to the riverlands will be held by 3 generals, Lord Eddard Stark, Prince Oberyn Martell, and Queen Visenya Targaryen. Enar announced, looking directly at Eddard, Oberyn, and Visenya. Visenya, like Rhaenys and Riella, has permission to destroy any house that refuses to kneel. At the same time, they also have the authority to grant land to soldiers who distinguish themselves on the battlefield. Enar looked at everyone and spoke aloud. His words caused many to express joy and determination. Feuds were not something common, let alone given out casually. Knowing that soldiers could win fiefs made many sons of lords' eyes light up. These sons had no right to inheritance, not even fiefdoms. Many became knights errant, and the luckiest ones managed to become masters of arms for some lord. As for the destruction of the noble houses of the Riverlands, they weren't worried. The possibility of gaining fiefdoms and becoming a rightful lord was enough for many there to become true barbarians, willing to do anything. Rhaenys observed everyone's expressions and couldn't help thinking that her brother really was fit to be king. Something that any lord would treat with caution boosted people's morale enormously. She had no doubt that these people would do anything to gain a piece of land. That's the power you and I want, Rhaenys. Look, your brother is deciding the fate of houses that have survived for thousands of years with just a few words. Rhaenys heard Arianne's whisper and couldn't help but agree with her. Such power was something everyone wanted to possess. Yes, I'm tempted by such power, but don't treat me like a woman of great ambition, Arianne. I don't want to waste my time on stupid palace intrigues. Rhaenys whispered to her cousin with a firm tone. You may not want to now, but when your child is born, you will. Every mother wants the best for her son, and being a prince, he'll need a fiefdom. But do you think only you will have a fiefdom? The other sons of Enar will also want it, and it will be a fierce battle. And the woman with the most power at court will decide who gets the best fiefdom. Arianne whispered in her ear with a serious tone. She would not allow Rhaenys to become passive in the future contest for power at court. If that happened, she and Rhaenys would be at the mercy of other women, and that was not to her liking. Rhaenys' eyes became determined at Arianne's words. Although she didn't want to get involved in a power struggle, she knew that, to ensure a comfortable future, she needed to have at least some influence at court. Looking at Enar discussing matters of war with the lords, her determination grew more and more. Riella watched everything with an interested eye. She knew things wouldn't get to the point of murder. After all, Enar would never allow anything like that to happen. Therefore, she would just watch everything with curiosity, without getting involved in this palace struggle. Enar didn't know that things were about to escalate, and even if he did, he would just laugh it off, finding it all very amusing. Entertainment was always welcome in his and anyone else's eyes. We'll start mobilizing the army in 3 days. We'll give the soldiers time to relax before the war, and we'll march on the 4th day. Enar finished the war orders, making everyone nod, especially the lord's sons. Even if the war was dangerous and many died, they didn't care. What really mattered to these young and middle-aged men was gaining merit and land. Enar watched everyone leave the Great Hall, returning to settle urgent matters of war, and remained silent, glimpsing the variables in this war. At night, in his room, just as Enar was about to lie down to sleep, Leda, who had remained in the room to ensure her king's safety, moved in an instant. Her figure was no more than a fleeting gray ray in the vision of an ordinary man. In the blink of an eye, Leda reached the balcony, her sword dangerously close to the invader's throat. Her eyes, sharp and trained, widened for a brief moment as she recognized the figure before her. A children of the forest. Leda murmured, still incredulous. She had seen so many things that would make anyone doubt reality, but meeting a children of the forest was something she had never expected to witness in her life. Enar, who maintained an unconcerned expression, looked curiously at the woman who had invaded her room. Although he already knew of their existence, it was the first time he had seen a children of the forest with his own eyes. "I am Leaf, 16th of my name and queen of the forest court." The children of the forest introduced herself with a surprisingly elegant tone. She bowed to Einar, while her golden eyes, which resembled those of a cat, stared at him with admiration and a touch of horror. Even though she had felt his presence before, seeing him in person shocked her deeply. Magic seemed to bow before the human in front of her, as if she were in the presence of a king. It was as if the magical essence itself recognized him as an absolute sovereign. At the same time, the air around him was incredibly pure. Leaf felt like a fish returning to the sea. The atmosphere around Einar overflowed with magic, and she couldn't help but deeply respect this dense, vibrant energy. Leaf. Einar murmured her name as the lines of the future unfolded before his eyes. He saw countless possibilities, including Leaf's own birth. He couldn't help but be amazed by that race, which resembled elves, but weren't elves. Honestly, he felt that these creatures were highly susceptible to the influence of the warp, and that was incredibly dangerous. However, when he looked into the history of the children of the forest, he realized that there wasn't a single record of madness among the mages of that race. That was shocking, to say the least. Getting out of bed, Einar walked over to the table in the bedroom and sat down, pouring 2 glasses of wine. "Come, satisfy my curiosity, Queen of the Forest and the children of the forest." Einar commented with a smile, staring directly into the golden-green eyes before him. Leda, upon hearing Einar's words, put Dawn away in her scabbard and moved back into position behind him. However, anyone could see the glint of curiosity in her eyes as she watched the children of the forest. Leaf looked like an adult, but she was slightly taller than a child, but not childish. Her skin was brown, with lighter patches that resembled the fur of a deer. She had 3 fingers and a thumb on each hand, sharp black claws instead of nails, and large ears. What was most striking about Leaf was her hair, a tangle of brown, red, and gold strands, the colors of autumn, with vines, twigs, and wilted flowers entwined in her locks. Under her hair, a crown of flowers and vines could be seen, evidencing her high status among the children of the forest. "Thank you, Your Grace." Seeing that Einar seemed receptive and kind, Leaf breathed a sigh of relief. Even though she knew she wouldn't be hurt by Brinden, she still felt a little stressed in front of such a powerful being. Sitting down in the chair opposite Einar, Leaf knew it was polite to drink her host's drink and took a sip without hesitation. However, as soon as she did, she started coughing after a small sip of wine. "Ha ha." Einar couldn't help but laugh at seeing the queen in such an embarrassing situation. He couldn't believe that a little wine and alcohol could make such a mystical being look so embarrassed. Leaf wanted the ground to open up and swallow her when she heard the laughter of the king sitting in front of her. She couldn't believe that grapes could taste so bad. How humans could drink something so unpleasant was a mystery she longed to understand. Putting aside the idea of drinking wine, Leaf put the cup back on the table and looked at Einar seriously, as if nothing had happened. "As I said before, I am Leaf, 16th of my name and queen of the forest court." She continued, "I have come at the request of Brinden, the Green Seer, to negotiate with the Dragon King." Einar, however, did not immediately begin the negotiations. Instead, he asked a completely different question than Leaf had expected. "How is my great-uncle?" Despite his surprise, Leaf answered sincerely, "His time is near. Soon, he will return to nature. The Green Seer is only not dead because the weirwood is maintaining his vitality, but if he leaves the Tree of Life, he will undoubtedly die." Leaf sighed as he remembered Brinden's condition. 120 years might seem like a lot, but for her, who had lived for thousands of years, it was just an insignificant number. But for humans to live so long was a real miracle. Einar let out a sigh when he heard Leaf's description. Brinden really was very old by human standards. In the end, human life would always come to an end. Not even the gods were truly eternal. "I thank you for looking after him all this time." I know how stubborn and annoying a Targaryen can be." Enar looked at Leaf and expressed his gratitude sincerely. "It's our responsibility to look after the Green Seer. Without him, we would have been dead a long time ago." Leaf shook his head and replied with a serious tone. Bryndon's arrival couldn't have been more timely for his race. The children of the forest were finally able to breathe a sigh of relief and fight the Night King more safely thanks to the presence of the Green Seer. How could they not help the one who had looked after them for so many years? Remembering something, Leaf put on a surprised expression and took a letter out of the coat made of leaves she was wearing. "This is something Bryndon wrote and asked me to deliver into your hands, Your Grace." Enar raised an eyebrow, puzzled. He didn't remember such an event happening in the future. How had Bryndon managed to hide from his prescience? Opening the letter, the first sentence made his countenance turn serious. "If you are reading this letter, Leaf has successfully delivered my last words. Don't come to the far north after reading this letter. Let me be a hero for the last time in my miserable, meaningless life. The Night King is too close to my location, and I will die at his hands. But before I leave, I'll leave him a kind gift. Fire and blood." Enar couldn't help but smile at Bryndon's heroic words and continued reading. "Before I go, I want to thank you for making my life useful again. You don't know how happy I am that you exist." "Thank you, Enar. To prevent any deity from predicting the future, or even the Great Other, I used my life as fuel to obscure some events of the future. In this way, I was able to escape your prescience. This spell won't last long, but it will be enough to catch the Night King off guard. I really want to see the look on that blue freak's face when he realizes he was almost killed by a mere human." Enar finally understood how Bryndon had escaped his prescience. However, the price for such a spell was too great, even for the gods. The gods may have seemed eternal, but they were not. They grew old and eventually fell into a deep sleep after many years. The only thing that could keep them young was human faith. That's why the evil gods allowed humanity to flourish before trying to exterminate it, accumulating as much faith as possible before the long night. For the gods, humans were like cattle, to be sacrificed as soon as they were no longer useful. In the end, I'll be dead soon. Thank you, Enar. Take care of House Targaryen. I wanted to see you one more time, my beloved Sharera Seastar. Looking at the final sentence, Enar couldn't help but let out a sigh. Bryndon would die the way he wanted to. That much was clear from the words written in the letter. The man wanted to leave as a hero until the last moment, the complete opposite of his father, Aegon the Unworthy. With a simple thought from Enar, crimson flames consumed the letter, reducing it to ashes in an instant. Thank you for bringing Bryndon's letter. Enar expressed his gratitude sincerely. As for Bryndon's death, he had no regrets or feelings of regret. He had no right to feel such things in the face of Bryndon's sacrifice. To have that kind of feeling would be a complete dishonor. Let's get to the negotiations. Enar looked at Leaf and declared, "State your terms, Queen of the Forest." Leaf took a deep breath and replied with a serious tone, "We want a forest where my people can live in peace, without interference from the human race. No man should enter it without our permission. We will answer to no one but the king on the Iron Throne. We will follow our own laws. The court of House Targaryen must not interfere with the laws of the Forest Court." Leaf pronounced each term with the dignity of a queen, despite the softness of her voice, which was sweet and slightly childish. Enar adopted a thoughtful expression. The first two terms were more than acceptable to him, but the last one made his expression turn grim. Leaf's proposal, in practice, would create a kingdom within the empire. He wanted to build something completely unacceptable. Enar sought absolute power, and allowing a non-human race to have such autonomy went against everything he wanted. The first two terms are acceptable, but the last one is not. You must kneel and accept my laws above your traditions and gods. Enar declared with a non-negotiable tone. He would not allow an independent kingdom to exist within his empire. What if the children of the forest refused to bend the knee because of this? Enar didn't care. He could win the war with or without their support. In the end, it wasn't him who was asking for something, but Leaf. Leaf couldn't hide her stunned expression when she heard Enar's implacable tone. In her eyes, the deal he was proposing was excellent. Enar would gain the support and magic of the children of the forest in the war against the Great Other. But how could Leaf understand the Dragon King's true goals? If he had studied all the monarchs who had ever ruled Westeros, he would have realized that Enar was the most tyrannical and controlling of them all. How could such a man accept something as unrealistic as allowing an independent kingdom within his empire? Your Grace is asking too much. How could we follow your laws above the laws of the gods? Leaf asked, his voice carrying a helpless tone. I have no respect for the laws of men or gods. Everyone must bend the knee. Enar replied coolly. Absolute submission. He knew very well that if Leaf ever had to choose between the Imperium and the old gods, the woman in front of him would choose the gods.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.